For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Hey guys, this is Standing for Truth. We are live. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to have a blast today. I've been looking forward to this. This is the much anticipated second debate between Taylor, aka Snake Was Right, and Dr. Kent Hovind. So I want to start off by thanking both these men for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us and give us this great debate. Today's debate will be on whether or not evolutionary mechanisms have limits. So I've got Matt Mann here, who everybody is, I'm sure, is familiar with, who will be co-moderating with me and just making sure this debate goes nice and smooth. So I'm going to hand it over to Matt to go over the format, introduce our debaters, and we will begin with Taylor. So go ahead, Matt.
All right. A lot of you probably know Taylor. He's debated Ken Hovind in the past. He goes by Snake Was Right. That is the name of his channel. He can send you a link to this after. And Ken Hovind probably needs no introduction. He's going to be the one who is going to be going second on this debate. We're going to be having 8-minute openings with a 5-minute rebuttal each, with a 22-minute discussion each, and then a 3-minute closing for each person with a 6-minute Q&A. So that was, I'm going to be giving 30-second warnings, so just listen for the sound. And that way I don't have to interrupt and butt in to say you have 30 seconds left. So I guess Snake is going first on this. And sure. I think Standing is going to be controlling the volume.
Yes, go ahead there, Snake. Start whenever you are ready. We'll start the timer on your first word. Go ahead.
All right, so I'll just explain my channel name real quick first. I call it Snake Was Right. Not as any claim that I am correct or anything like that. It's just a reference to the biblical serpent, and my belief that knowledge of good and evil was actually a good thing and not a bad thing that would result. Well, actually, no matter how bad it is, the truth is important to know, even if there are bad consequences. So I think in that instance, the snake was right. And so the biblical serpent is one of my literary heroes. And so we'll just jump into the science. I'm studying biology, molecular biology at CU Boulder in Colorado. And the topic today is about whether the mechanisms of evolution have a limit. And so we've gotten to this point over the history of creation where they're essentially backed into a corner, it seems, with because they have been forced to accept microevolution but not macroevolution. And so they do accept all the mechanisms that lead to variation within kind, they say, but it remains to be seen what the limit of a kind is or where they draw that line. And I would love to discuss that. Clearly, there are limits, but it doesn't seem like they're defined by the creationist side. It seems that they just claim that the limit is a kind. And to a biologist, that doesn't really make sense because we know that the limit would be in the basically at the molecular level. You can't just break the laws of physics or chemistry. That's essentially the limit. So I think that we should just get into discussing some of those mechanisms. I think I'm going to give away most of my time here in favor of just discussion, but we'll go over some of the mechanisms just to get us started. Basically, I've heard Kent before talk about how the evolutionary process is just a selection process. It cannot create. It's not a creative process. And he gives the example that sticks in my mind is with the tallness, basically, out of a population. So he'll say things like, and correct me if I'm wrong or misrepresenting, that you can get certain traits that out of the population that already exist to basically get exaggerated. So in his example, he would say that evolution or microevolution can select for the tallest people in a population, but it cannot create new features. So I would like to correct that because it seems that this way of looking at things ignores the mutation. Mutation does create things. It creates variation. And so evolution is not just a selective process. It creates differences, and then the selection process kicks in. And we can also talk about SFT. He and I have had several discussions about the limits of evolution in the sense that he believes in the genomic decay accumulation or accumulation of deleterious mutations. And there are several mechanisms to that counterbalance that as well. I suspect that we'll be talking more about how do mutations actually create steps towards different kinds, but I think we should start off hearing what Kent defines as a kind, because last time we talked, I showed him the ring species, and according to his definition, according to my understanding of his definition, a kind is that which brings forth. And so I gave him an example of several salamander species which can bring forth with each other until, except for two of the species that can't bring forth with each other. So therefore, they are not the same kind, and yet he is still able to recognize that they are all salamanders based on their phenotype and I'm assuming their genotype. So it would seem that we're actually not work definition that has anything to do with reproduction and more based on anatomical features. So I think I will concede the rest of my time at that.
Okay, you stopped 3 minutes early, so I guess we can move that into Q&A for later. All right, and Kent, whenever you're ready.
All right. I guess we got 8 minutes for the opening. If I get my timer here. Thank you so much. And it's Taylor, I appreciate you trying to defend what you believe. I think we'll be able to get you converted if you're honest and open, and you become an independent Baptist one of these days, and a Bible believer. So the debate topic is: do the proposed mechanisms of evolution have any limits? We have to define some of these words. First of all, what are the mechanisms? So just the word mechanism has to do with a machine. Anybody would tell you any machine has to have a designer. There are no machines anywhere that I'm aware of that came without a designer of some kind. Whether they're natural machines like trees that can pump water up to the leaves, which is amazing that they can, without having a heart or a pump, they can draw water up with capillary action and with root pressure and with transpiration, can get water 350 feet in the air off the ground. I mean, that's quite a pump to pump. And it's an amazing mechanism that allows trees to do that. There are quite a few mechanisms in the biological world, like your heart would be considered a mechanism to be able to pump blood around your body, which is stunning in its complexity. Ask any heart surgeon, how stunning, how amazing is the heart? And I think anybody with one eye and half a brain would tell you it's beyond comprehension in its complexity. So we have lots of mechanisms in our shop, for instance, which I'm in the shop now, next to our shop. We have all kinds of tools to work on these mechanisms because they don't fix themselves. So what is the mechanism for evolution? And this word evolution has to be carefully defined. This seems to be where Taylor is hung up on what exactly, they'll say, he said, for instance, that the creationists, assuming he's meaning me, are backed into a corner by accepting microevolution. Absolutely not. I accept the obvious fact that animals can produce a variety. There is no question. There are, I think, 60 recognized breeds of chickens now that probably had a common ancestor called a chicken. So certainly there are variations within the kind. I don't think we should call it microevolution. I have always said for 30 years now, I think it's a lousy term. However, that's the term they use, so I'll explain it. But Microevolution is a variation of the same kind of animal. Like we talked about taller people and shorter people. Sure, that's a variation of people. There are no exceptions where any human has ever produced anything other than a human. Or no dog's ever produced anything other than a dog. And the evolutionists, I'm stunned now that they don't see the stupidity of what they're saying. They're saying, of course, evolution predicts dogs will always produce dogs. I say, wait a minute. You believe somewhere in the past something non-dog produced a dog. I mean, if it came from an amoeba, hello, that's a non-dog. So why can it happen in the past? It can't happen where we can watch it and observe it. Science deals with things we can observe, study, test, and demonstrate. Evolution is none of those. So does it have any limits? Well, here is what the Wikipedia or Berkeley University's just on internet today. I said, what is the mechanism of evolution? They said, well, there are 4 mechanisms, 4 things that make it happen. One is mutation, then migration or gene flow, then genetic drift, and natural selection as mechanisms of change, from khanacademy.org. How variation, differential reproduction, and hereditary result in evolution by natural selection. Here it is from bifi.es. NUCTUNT. I don't know if you can read my screen there or not. But what are the 4 mechanisms of evolution? Allele frequencies in a population may change due to 4 fundamental forces of evolution: natural selection, genetic drift, mutations, and gene flow. The same one given on the Berkeley website. This seems to be the teaching is you guys believe that your fairy tale, your religion of evolution will somehow be true because of these 4 things. I would start off and concede right away, natural selection works. A, it is natural, and it's a selection process. It's not a creation process. Your argument a minute ago that the mutation provides the new material, and now natural selection can act on it. I think we can demonstrate that has never been observed. Never. That is a religion. It's SpongeBob imagination stuff. And if you want to believe it, fine. But don't force that on all the kids to learn that stuff, these innocent minds that are going thinking they're going to learn science, and instead they learn a religion of evolution. I agree natural selection works, but it selects. That's all it does. And I've given the illustration, and nobody's ever refuted it. If I decided I want to select a population of people over 7 feet tall, so I go through and I kill everybody in the world who's under 7 feet tall. Only those who are 7 and over can reproduce now because they're the only ones alive. And many of their children will grow up to be very tall. But if they don't, we kill them, okay? After 5 or 6 or 10 generations of doing that, we would have a whole population of people over 7 feet tall. No question, that can be done. That's what farmers do. They select for cows that give more milk. And after about 8 or 10 generations, all the cows give more milk than normal. However, the cows are weaker. They couldn't survive in the wild, but the farmer does have a herd of cows that gives more milk or more beef or more heat resistance or whatever they're selecting for. That's artificial selection, but it's the same concept. Nature would select certain animals to survive in certain environments, just by either by temperature. For example, the dogs in Alaska generally have long hair and have thicker bodies and shorter legs to conserve heat. Whereas the dogs in the dingoes in Australia have real thin hair, have skinny bodies, long legs to get away from the desert, and they get rid of the heat faster. The dingoes can handle the heat, but they could never handle Alaska. They'd freeze first winter. And the wolves and the huskies up in Alaska would die of heat stroke in the Australian outback desert. So nature has selected those 2 varieties of dogs to survive in that particular environment. That's not a creative process. The dogs already had hair. It just decided, is it going to be long hair or short hair? It didn't create a furnace or a heating system or a coal burning stove. It's just hair. So all it did, nature selected long hair or short hair, and that happens. I agree. But that's where it stops. It's not a creative process at all. Mutations now, if you think mutations are going to help, I think you're dreaming. No mutation has ever been observed that makes the creature better off. I use the illustration. Well, the textbooks are going to say natural selection is observed. Of course, natural selection is observed. Nature selects. We could select dogs to get them smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually end up with a completely useless dog like a Chihuahua. But it's still a dog. Still in the, what kind is yours? A Yorkie? Yorkie. You have the Chihuahua, okay. How long would that last in the woods, in nature? 30 minutes, right? Okay, man has selected smaller and smaller dogs to have them for a lap dog or a companion or whatever. They will never get a dog as small as a flea. There is a limit. There are animals as small as a flea, like a flea. They'll never get a dog as big as an elephant, even though there are mammals as big as an elephant, like an elephant. So nature selects, but it's always the same kind. But in the evolution fairy tale, they say the first true cells slowly evolved into humans. The protozoa gradually became a human.
Time.
Now, if the protozoa, time's up. Anyway, I think natural selection works, but that's all it does is select. It doesn't create a thing. Okay, sorry about that.
Would you be able to, in between this, zoom the camera back that we can't see your screen all the way?
Oh, Steve, did you hear that? Zoom the camera back. They can't see the screen all the way.
I'm pretty sure they can.
No,
I can't. Right there.
there we go. Okay, looks good. Looks perfect.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that opening, Dr. Hovind and Taylor. So now we're going to move into the rebuttal period with Taylor. I believe is it 5 minutes there, Matt?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Taylor.
Okay, so you are correct when you say natural selection only selects, but
Good.
natural selection is not the entire process of evolution. In fact, the clip you showed up there said, quote, mutations are the ultimate source for new alleles in the population. So it seems like you are ignoring the effects that mutations have based on some nebulous wording of adding information. And you say, we have never observed mutation adding information, and that's just patently untrue. It's called a duplication event, and we observe them all the time. Now, this is new physical information. Even just like if you have two identical chairs and you add a third, that is new, and that is a new chair. And then if you start changing the parts of the chair, that is a different chair. So that's exactly what happens in mutation. Some genes are duplicated and then changed. Some genes are just duplicated. Some genes that exist are not duplicated and changed. And these are all examples of different information. Now, I suspect that Kent is going to go in and say that this is not an example of new information because of the way he defines information. And I don't know how else to explain it, but if you change the sequence of something, the information is different. And if you add more of it, that is adding information. It doesn't matter. You can 10,000 Bibles. If you add one more Bible, that's adding another Bible. That's adding information. Now, it's not new information, and that's where mutation comes in. Mutations are adding new information because they are altering the sequence of information. I suspect we will have a nice back and forth about that, but that's my correction so far. And I still notice you haven't really defined a kind. Is it based on reproduction or is it based on body type? And you seem to be indicating the latter because you say, when you're talking about size of an animal, you say that's where it stops. I'm not sure how you know that's when it stops, other than you just kind of feel like it. So, like, the question I would pose to you, couldn't a dog, for example, become bear-like? Or and to illustrate this, I would ask also, if one type of dog could no longer reproduce with the other types of dogs, does this indicate a big enough change in kind to equal macroevolution? It seems like you don't want to define your goalposts so that we can't meet them. So you just say it stops at kind. You don't define kind. But then the reason I say you've been backed into a corner is because you've already admitted that these changes occur at the genetic level, which produce a change in the phenotypes. And this is going to be a major sticking point for me. Natural selection only selects. But when you say that, you are ignoring the effects of mutation. So mutations will produce different alleles. So you have different information to select from. Different information is being for each selection event. This is not just selection. It is an interaction between selection and differentiation. And therefore, that's where complexity emerges. And it seems almost intelligent because it is selecting, but it's selecting the best configurations. And it was also claimed that there are no beneficial mutations at all, and that's simply false. The best example of that is with drug-resistant bacteria. And before you get to the claim that in a new gene that confers drug resistance to the bacteria, it's been claimed by creationists that this then inherently lowers the fitness of the bacteria natural environment. I have several experiments here that witness mutations fixing essentially that lower fitness conferred by the drug resistance, and we also witness the staph, for example, is actually surviving better in its wild population after evolving a drug resistance. So those claims are all simply false, and we have direct observation of that both in the wild and the laboratory. So I think we should discuss more on what information means. Did you say time? Okay.
Yeah. All right. And I'll start the time when you start talking, Ken.
All right. Well, thank you so much. He's got several things on the table here. If a dog can no longer produce with another dog, probably I would guess there are mechanical limits where the Chihuahua cannot reproduce with the Great Dane. Maybe there aren't. I don't know. But it's still a dog, and I think it's intuitive, but obviously it's still a dog. And you said, I don't define kind. Well, the Bible says in the original creation, the kinds would bring forth. And so I don't know that there can't be variations that would make them incapable of bringing forth, like, for instance, the dogs with the Chihuahua and the Great Dane. But it's still obviously a dog. I would point out, though, Taylor, that I'm not asking for my belief to be taught at taxpayer expense in the schools. You guys are demanding that everybody pay for your religion to be taught. You guys should go start private schools and teach evolution to anybody that wants to pay and come learn it and get it out of the public schools. It's not science. Nobody's ever seen it. You said the best example you know of is drug-resistant bacteria. For heaven's sake, son, it's still a bacteria. Do you think that process of a bacteria becoming resistant to drugs, it's still a bacteria, do you think that process could turn a bacteria to an elephant or a whale or a human? I cannot comprehend how somebody cannot see the folly of that belief that this variation within a bacteria is going to produce a whale out of the bacteria if we give it enough time. I know you guys count on this, billions of years being the solution to everything. And I cover many ways in my seminar to take away the billions of years. It cannot be billions of years old, but that's not this debate. Are the mechanisms that are supposedly driving evolution, are they limited? Of course they're limited. They're limited physically, obviously. They're never going to get an elephant as big as Texas or the United States. There are physical limits there. I think every evolutionist I've talked to would admit that. Of course, there are some limits. They don't like to go there because they know it's starting to paint them into a corner. Are there limits based on size? Are there limits based upon food availability? Are there limits based upon heat resistance, heat tolerance, let's say? Sure. The dogs, if you took all the dogs in the world, turned them loose into Alaska, go back in 5 years, the only survivors are the husky type body, thick fur, etc. Nature selected them to survive. But they're never going to survive at 200 below zero. Nothing would survive. There are limits. They might be able to survive at 40 below zero, Alaska temperatures, but they're not going to survive at 200 or 300 or 400 below zero Fahrenheit. They're not going to happen. There are limits. The dingoes in Australia can survive at 130 degrees. It's pretty amazing. but they can't survive at 500 degrees or 10,000 degrees or 2 trillion degrees. There is a limit. So there are limits to all these things that I think are just obvious to anybody. Secondly, I would point out, science deals with things we can observe, study, test, and demonstrate. Nobody observes or has ever observed a bacteria produce a non-bacteria. The bacteria that is resistant to drugs is still a bacteria that didn't change into any other life form. So the variations happen, but they're limited by all sorts of things. They're limited by genetics. No new information is ever added. You said if you had 10,000 Bibles and added another Bible, you now have more Bibles. Yeah, but you don't have any new information. Then you say mutations are going to fix this. That's like saying if I type out a sentence enough times and make typographical errors, my typos are going to make it into a sentence with totally new meaning and typos destroy, typographical errors destroy. There are no mutations you can point to that have added information that is useful. You're counting on typographical errors in the gene code, which is incredibly complex to start with. You're counting on some kind of errors in gene transmission to create something new. I know it sounds good, and I guess theoretically it might even be possible, but it's never happened. It's not observed. It's not science. It's SpongeBob imagination stuff. And I really enjoyed listening to you guys tell about your imagination, but that's not science. I'm sorry. Staph surviving better, it's still staph, okay? So ring species, the chameleons or whatever it was that went around California are still a chameleon or still a lizard or still the same kind of animal. To a 5-year-old, they could tell you. Now, they may not be reproducing now. Okay, big deal. They're still the same kind of animal. Everybody knows that. That process of ring species is not going to turn a bacteria to a whale or an elephant or a mosquito. You're dreaming. And that's okay. I appreciate you dreaming. Stop making everybody pay for that dream to be taught in the schools. Let's see. There. Okay? My time's up. Thank you.
All right. We're going to move on to the discussion period, 22 minutes. And it'll be a back and forth. And try to make it equal time between you guys and keep it calm. All right. I'll start the timer when you guys begin. Snake, you're paused. Snake, you're muted.
Yeah. Okay. I do that. So he says that staph is still staph, and yes, but I think you're mixing goalposts here. So the goalpost I was addressing there was that it evolved a beneficial gene, not to demonstrate that bacteria has evolved into something else, but that it has evolved a beneficial gene. So maybe we should stick with that goalpost.
Well, I know you're anxious to get this word evolved into the sentence. Staph evolved a beneficial gene. Do you mean there was a mutation? Something went wrong in the genetic code and it happens to be beneficial? The staph didn't make this decision on its own, did it?
If it's beneficial, then it's not wrong.
Okay, so the staph has become resistant to a certain... What exactly happened with the staph that you think was beneficial?
It is drug resistant.
And is it indeed stronger in the regular population of other like kinds?
Yes, it is flourishing in hospitals, and it's a really bad problem because it is flourishing more than the non-resistant staph.
So if it's flourishing in hospitals, where of course they have all kinds of antibiotics and stuff going around, are you trying to claim that it would then be flourishing in the wild? Hospitals
that is the wild.
The hospital is the wild?
Yes. A human body is the wild for pathogens.
So you don't think you have a limited environment there with using the hospital as your example? And
that's the environment. That's the environment it lives in, human bodies. And it spreads very quickly inside of human buildings where there is close human contact.
So the staph becoming resistant to drugs that treat it is evidence enough for you that elephants and mosquitoes are related.
No, that's different. You see, you're mixing the goalposts here. It's evidence.
Yes,
you are. Yes, you are. It's evidence that there are beneficial mutations.
And this, what you said, was the best one you could point to.
It's a very easy one. I can point to other ones.
All right,
I can point to ones where we've actually isolated the mutation that makes it back fitness and higher fitness in the wild.
So this what are examples besides the staph, which is not in the wild, it's in the hospital. It has a higher fitness in a hospital in human bodies that are in the hospital, where they have all kinds of bacteria and drug killing stuff going around. What is an example of something out in the natural world that has added information and made it better?
Well, what do you consider the natural world? Because the drug-resistant staph is actually spread outside of hospitals too.
Okay, would you agree that farmers all over the world, for the recorded history of the world, we have actual recorded history back maybe 4,000, 5,000 years. Do you think every farmer has ever observed cows produce cows? Has anybody seen it produce anything other than a cow? We have a bunch of cows, a herd of cows across the fence here. They produce cows. No exceptions.
So are we moving on from the goalpost of beneficial mutations? Are you admitting that beneficial mutations can happen?
No, I'm not admitting that at all. I know you keep mentioning that phrase, moving the goalpost. You guys want to move the goalpost all the time. I think the goalpost is very clear. The Bible, which came way before Charles Darwin or anybody else, said the animals will bring forth after their kind. And every farmer will tell you when he crossbreeds cows, he gets cows. It's not moving the goalpost. A cow is a cow. You might give a cow that gives more milk or more beef or heat resistance, but it's still a cow. And you can get race horses that are faster than other horses. Okay, still a horse. You're never going to turn a horse to a cow, let alone get a horse from a bacteria.
We're focusing on the mechanisms of change in evolution, and you claimed that there is no such thing as a beneficial mutation. So I'm just focusing on that goalpost alone right now. Okay.
So the beneficial mutation you want to point to is staph has become resistant to the drugs in the hospital, and therefore that is evidence enough that there is new information, you claim. I'll have to analyze that, exactly what was different in the gene code. Is indeed the staph more viral, more lively, more likely to survive in the wild? I'm going to say I doubt that. Not in the hospital maybe, but not out in nature in the wild. Is this drug-resistant staph found any place outside of the hospital?
Yes. It's contracted by sports players quite frequently, in locker rooms and things like that. Close human contact.
Close human contact in locker rooms. Okay.
That is the wild environment of a pathogen that lives in human bodies. Is a human body. Yeah. And so places where humans interact is going to spread that.
And so this is still, you agree it's still a single-celled creature, a bacteria, right? Single-celled.
Yeah. And no other kind of phylum or genus has ever come from bacteria. That no one thinks that bacteria have evolved into eukaryotes or anything like that.
I think I can show you where the textbooks have pictures by the thousands of humans and whales and mosquitoes, and all of them, they draw lines on paper back to a common ancestor, which is a single-celled protista or
but not a bacteria.
Okay, a protista then. It's still a single. Are there any two-celled organisms in the world that you're aware of?
Yeah.
There are?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like some of those for my science center here. Would you send them out, please?
They found them in algae. They found single, double cell, triple cell, pretty much every number up to hundreds. And then we've observed them in the lab evolving new traits, and specifically evolving multicellularity.
And you're claiming they found 2 or 3 or multi-celled creatures in the lab, right?
They found single-celled algae in the wild. And subjected them to selection pressures like predators, and they evolved multicellularity.
I'll have to investigate that. I'm going to say right now, I doubt that seriously. It might be a colony or cooperation, but it's not a two-celled organism. But to go from an amoeba or a single-celled organism to something like a whale or an elephant is going to require a whole lot more than just a cooperation of cells.
That never happens. No one thinks that happens.
It never happens. Great, you're a creationist. They had to be created.
No protist has ever produced a whale.
Do you think, I just showed you the picture where they say the protists came from the whales. Here, I'll show you again. This is straight from the textbooks here.
You're taking it far too literally. It's not born straight from that. There are millions of intermediate steps between them.
Well, I know you imagine that there are. You believe that there are, and you imagine it, but that's not safe. Here we go. Here's a textbook used by the kids in public school. Protista, single-celled, slowly turned to biology teacher. Not slowly. Well, yeah, they would say, if it happened quickly, we would all recognize it as a fairy tale. But because they say it happens slowly, then it becomes science. You guys think that millions of years is going to help. You think this example you have of a single-celled creature becoming resistant to drugs is going to help. This is what they are teaching. This is my objection, Taylor. None of this is science. This is lines on paper. This is imagination. This is, I hope it's true. I think it's true. I wish it was true. It's not observed. They're saying frogs and birds are related because they drew a line on paper. Do you believe frogs and birds are related?
Yes, but not because of lines on the paper. That's a summation of the data, and you're confusing that with the actual data.
So what is the actual data that would make you think a frog and a bird are related? They got them right next to each other here.
Well, you've already admitted 90% of my argument, which is that things can variate within their kind. And so a dog is just a variation of a mammal.
A dog is a variation of a mammal. Now, they're having a frog, a bird, and a fish coming off the same line. So could you recognize, if I handed you a frog and a bird, would you be able to tell the difference?
Yeah. And if you handed me a dinosaur and a bird, they would look very similar. In fact, they have almost identical biochemistry. They have the same type of feet. They have proven that hairs and scales and feathers all develop from the same developmental, they're called placodes. And they are all made of the same material, and they all develop from the same things.
They're all made of keratin. I'm familiar with that. Scales and hair and feathers made of keratin.
So a station can produce a different type of being.
Well, keratin is a great building product to build things out of. There's a whole lot of stuff made out of iron. Battleships are made out of iron, so are forks. You think battleships and forks are related?
No, because they can't reproduce. They can't have sex with each other and make more.
Adding reproduction makes it 1 trillion times more complicated, not less complicated. Just because a battleship and a fork and an automobile are all made out of iron does not prove any relationship. It proves a common building material. The designer who designed the bird and who have feathers, which are made out of a feather, is complicated. Look at one under the magnifying glass. It's made of keratin, a great building product. So are scales, so are hairs, I understand. But you're saying that proves a relationship. No, it proves a common designer. Somebody used the same building material to build it. That's all.
It doesn't prove either way, but what it does demonstrate is that slight changes between them can lead to the differences that we actually see. And there's no indication that, see, you can't point to a difference between a creation event and a variation event. Are there millions and millions of different creation events? Because there are different types of bird feet, and there are different types of bird feathers. What's the difference between a bird that has adapted from another bird and all the different bird types that God has supposedly created specially?
Yeah, I don't know how many kinds of birds God made. It might have been 100 kinds of birds. And today they've diversified into 5,000 varieties of birds.
How can you tell the difference between a diversification and a creation?
That's a hard one. And I'm not asking for my theory to be taught at public expense. But I think there are people working on that. I think most of it's intuitive to a 5-year-old. If you put a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, they would say it's the same kind of animal. If you put a Chihuahua and a banana, they would say it's not.
We don't ask 5-year-olds for their opinions on complex science, though.
No, but that's where they teach it to the 5-year-olds, that they put stuff like this in their books, and the kid sees the picture and thinks a frog and a bird are related, came from an amoeba or protista. This is the propaganda machine you guys are running, and I think it's evil, absolutely evil. You're destroying the faith of young children by this stupidity and these lies. There is no proof any bird has ever produced a non-bird or came from a non-bird. There is no evidence any frog has ever come from a non-frog. None. You can believe it if you want, but it's not science.
Most Christians believe in evolution. Most people who believe and study evolution are Christians. So there is no assault on the faith at all.
Well, the majority opinion means nothing. That's obviously a logical fallacy. We don't care. The majority opinion in the South thought slavery was fine 150 years ago.
Right, but what I'm saying is that Christians can believe in evolution. Teaching evolution does not destroy Christians, does not destroy faith in Christianity.
Well, they're certainly not a Bible-believing Christian. The Bible clearly teaches God made everything in 6 days. Do you believe everything was created in 6 days?
Well, everyone has different interpretations. Some people believe some parts of the Bible are literal, and they believe that other parts are metaphorical, and there are stories that contain lessons that aren't meant to be literal, and that is a lot of Christians. And that's a typical Christian belief.
Yeah, tell them to give me a call. I'll be glad to straighten them out, because they're certainly not following what the Bible says. Jesus said the creation of Adam was the beginning. Matthew 19:4, Mark 10:6. Was Jesus lying? Was he mistaken? Was he stupid? Or could he have been right? Was the creation of Adam the beginning? That's what Jesus said.
I don't know, but would a Christian say that it's important to believe that part, or to believe that Jesus is their personal savior?
Well, they would have a different Jesus than I have. The Mexican baseball player's named Jesus. Just because, if there's someone says Jesus claimed the creation of Adam was the beginning. So if they don't believe that part, why should they believe the part where he said, I can, forgive your sins and take you to heaven? What would
because they still believe in the teachings of Jesus that are love and forgiveness, and that he is the divine Son of God. Those are the important parts of Christianity.
Well, I think there's a lot more to it than that. If you could find, is there any book then that the Christians are supposed to follow? We're getting way off topic.
Well, that's why there's so many Christian sects, because they disagree on slight details, but they're all still Christians.
I know they should call me, because I'm the only one that's right on all that stuff, and they should. I'll straighten them out.
The only one.
And I think that's a good point to end that
Okay.
topic off. If we want to go back to the topic of the mechanisms, go ahead, gentlemen.
So I have another paper talking about antibiotic resistance, and also detailing the mutations that happened after that mutation, which also raised its fitness levels. If you want to go into the actual experiments. Can you hear me?
I hear you. Yes. Are you asking me a question? No.
Yeah. Do you want to go into that level of detail, or talk about the definition of kinds? Because I still have a bone to pick with that, or new information I think would be probably the most productive.
I think you guys are frantically searching for anything to offer, scientific support for your religion. You believe whales and tomatoes are related. You really believe that. That's okay. I don't care. You believe birds and frogs are related, and they came from a protista. I know you believe that. You believe it very strongly. And you're looking for evidence of that. And the best evidence you've been able to come up with is a single-celled creature becoming resistant to some kind of bacteria, some kind of antibiotic, some kind of drug.
Well, that's a misrepresentation of what I used that for. I used that to address your claim that there are no beneficial mutations.
So you believe that one beneficial, what you think is a beneficial mutation, that added, let's see, what were your words here? It raised the fitness level. Let's take an organism most people would be more familiar with, like the human body. Probably everybody listening has one of those. What can you give of an example of anything that has raised the fitness level through mutations in humans?
The ability to drink milk. Some humans do not have this gene, and humans that live in places with high elevation with cows, they've all evolved this gene.
So the people who live in high elevations with cows have evolved the ability to drink milk. Is that what you're saying?
Whereas other humans have not.
Well, I was born and raised at low elevation, Illinois, which is only like 800 feet above sea level, and I love milk. I've been drinking it all my life. So
yeah, we're talking about evolutionary history, not modern day humans.
So you believe humans evolved the ability to drink milk? Is that what you're saying?
Some humans do not have this gene that creates an enzyme that can digest milk.
I'm familiar with that. And so the ability to drink milk or not, to digest milk or not, after being weaned, okay, you're claiming that's a mutation, and that it's a beneficial mutation. Is that an example?
Yeah.
So what did it add?
There are also humans who have HIV-resistant genes.
HIV-resistant gene from sickle cell anemia, are you talking about?
No.
So
that would be for malaria.
Oh, yeah, malaria, okay. So a detrimental disease like sickle cell anemia or malaria or any of them, if somebody has a resistance to that disease, That's evidence of a mutation that may humans come from non-humans, we came from a protista?
Well, it is a difference in the biochemistry, and as far as we know, biochemistry is determined by your genes. And this gene has been isolated.
We've got 5 minutes left for the discussion, guys. 5 minutes. Thanks.
All right. And the genes that you're talking about, are they themselves like complex, or are they simple? Is a gene simple or is it complex?
It's a difference in a single protein, I believe. It doesn't really matter if it's complex or simple. It's new information either way.
So if a computer code, let's say Microsoft PowerPoint, has how many lines of code? Steve, how many lines of code in Microsoft PowerPoint? Hundreds of thousands, okay? If we had a change in one of those lines of code, if something happened, my computer was zapped or x-rayed or something like that, and it upset the code of Microsoft PowerPoint, the chances of that being a beneficial change are, I'd say, real close to zero. Certainly there would be billions of times more likely to be negative.
All you need is one that works. As long as it's above zero, then that will be selected for. All the ones that don't work can just get thrown in the trash. And they actually have designed computer programs that do this to them. They become more efficient.
Well, I'm sure you realize this line of thinking leads straight to Adolf Hitler. Let's find the more advanced ones and throw the other ones in the trash, the ones that don't have this beneficial mutation.
But we don't do that. We're just studying how nature does that.
Sure. Well, the title was, do the mechanisms of evolution have limits? I think they do. The ones you mentioned, the best ones you could come up with, are still a protista or a bacteria. They're limited, obviously. It didn't change to any other obvious kind of creature. Now, you believe that this change that happened, this resistance to drugs, can somehow accumulate to make that eventually, over millions of years, turn into an elephant or a mosquito or a butterfly. That's not science. I'm trying to get you to see it. I don't understand why you don't.
I understand what you're saying, but
really?
Yeah, that's not a limit. That's just a change. So the limit would be, is there the accumulation of those small changes? So like, is a change between a single-celled organism, a single-celled algae, and a multicellular algae, does that meet your criteria for a change from one organism to the other, one kind?
I guess I'd have to have it shown to me that this two-celled algae is actually not just cooperation between two cells, a colony, rather than an actual new creature.
Well, it is. The two-celled ones are, but then there are multicellular ones that evolved from the two cells.
I think you'd find most biologists would strongly disagree with you on what you just said. Now, you believe that. Somebody may have taught you that. But even that, with a cell, which is incredibly complex, learning to work together with another cell is designed beyond comprehension. I mean, that takes brain power. That just doesn't happen. That's like getting two computers to work with each other, solving a problem. I suppose that could be done. Multiple computers.
I could claim that. But just theoretically, if that could be demonstrated, would that satisfy your goalpost?
I think if we could demonstrate that two cells have accumulated, or two individual cells have bonded to become a two-celled creature, that would be interesting. I'd like to study that out. Is it then going to survive? I don't think there are any examples of it where it survives in nature, or it even happens in nature. They might force it to happen in a laboratory someplace. I suppose you could weld the front end off a motorcycle on the back end of a car and make a tricycle out of it. It took a designer to do that. So I don't think that the title of the debate was, do the mechanisms of evolution have limits? I think I've clearly demonstrated, and you've clearly demonstrated, yes, they have limits. You've not shown any idea or even a theory how a protista can turn to a human. You show a protista becoming a protista resistant to drugs. I know you believe these small changes will accumulate, but if only one change out of a billion is beneficial, those other billion have to die. Now that one beneficial one has to get another beneficial one.
That's why it's slow.
That's why you got to
observe that. We observe that. You admit that. We've proven it in the labs, and you just don't like the time scale.
I don't like the time scale or the mechanism. It doesn't work. It doesn't happen. we don't see accumulation of these mutations. We don't see it. Every farmer will tell you they try to accumulate the mutations where their cows produce more milk or more beef. They try. They artificially select for this, which is much faster than natural selection. They artificially select, trying to get, let's take a dog, a smaller dog, okay? But they still get a dog.
But they're not trying to get a different, they're not trying to make it not a cow.
Okay, could you, with artificial selection, crossbreed dogs and get a non-dog? Do you think you'll ever be able to get a non-dog from any amount of time? Could you turn a dog to a cat?
Closing.
Okay, guys, awesome back and forth. Thanks so much, Dr. Hovind. Thanks so much, Taylor. That was a blast. What we're going to do now is move into the quick closing statements, just to sum everything up. I think because Snake started, we'll start with you, then Dr. Hovind. Then we've got time. Let me see here for a 10-minute Q&A. So go ahead there, Snake.
Okay, how much do I have?
3 minutes.
Okay. So real quick, the reason evolution is taught in schools is because we actually, or the scientific body, scientists who deal in the mainstream science, actually produce cures, and creationism does not. So even if we're wrong, that's the reason it's taught. And I started out this debate saying, of course, there are limits. That, you know, you can't just keep increasing the size of a thing infinitely. But what I wanted to focus on was the fact that even creationists accept that there are small changes, and these do accumulate, and they do accumulate beneficially. And so it doesn't matter how many bad mutations you get, because those will just die. What matters is the beneficial ones, and those are the ones that stick around. And I have demonstrated that there are beneficial mutations, even though I suspect Kent will go back to just saying that there are none. So all you need is, so what is the limit of the changes in biochemistry? We do observe that there are changes to the biochemistry in cells, specifically asking about whether a single cell to a multicellular, if that could be demonstrated, would that meet Kent's goalposts? And he did not want to answer yes or no. I suspect so he can, because that would satisfy what he's asking, but his faith would prevent him from actually accepting it. So what happens there is a single gene changing the way that the different cells communicate with each other. And that's been observed in an experiment. So my question is, what is the limit to these small biochemical changes, which, if they did over millions of years, would produce very different organisms, even if you're going to call them all the same kind, which scientists kind of do. We call them all eukaryotes if we're talking about, you know, what is the limit there? He just kind of says, of course there's a limit. And the limit is the kind. I'm not seeing any mechanism for that change or for that limit, because each generation produces different information, which is then selected for against in different ways according to the environment. And it doesn't matter if it's artificial or not. And I think you're kind of blurring the lines there between artificial and natural when humans inhabit these artificial spaces, and then we also have pathogens that infect us. Well, is that a natural or is that an artificial environment? Well, that's what they live in.
Did he say time?
All right. Yeah, that was time.
Well, good. Well, thank you for doing this. The reason communism is taught in North Korean schools is because everybody believes in it, and anybody who doesn't believe in it doesn't have a right to live. I mean, so of course it has to be true because all the teachers are teaching it, and all the universities believe it, all the books, everything published in the newspaper supports communism. That's proof that communism works, I mean, because everybody believes in it in North Korea. You know, the reason Islam is taught and that Muhammad was a prophet, the reason that's taught in Iran is because everybody believes it, therefore it has to be true. So everybody should be forced to teach that, you know, Islam in the Iranian schools because it has to be true, because that's the only thing that's taught. This is the logic you guys are using. Of course, evolution has to be true because that's all the majority teach it. I agree, our education system has been co-opted and corrupted by this evolution religion. It is, you guys have won the war in taking over the educational system. It's all through the textbooks, okay? Evolution, here we go. The butterfly and the spider and the elephant are related to a common ancestor. You guys have won the war by deception of getting your religion taught by everybody in all the school system. But it's not science. Nobody's ever demonstrated any animal producing a different kind. You have a great imagination. The limit is your imagination. In your mind, you think, wow, this can happen. Well, it's like a kid thinking, wow, I can fly if I put my underwear on the outside of my pants and paint it red. You know, I can fly and I have superpowers. It's imagination. It's not true. It's not observed. All we've ever observed in all of humanity is dogs produce dogs, cows produce cows. There are no exceptions to that. Nobody's ever, no, they've even tried to make it happen. Try to turn the dog into a non-dog. Or can you turn the bacteria into a non-bacteria? You claiming it's got new information and drug resistance, it's still a bacteria. Can you, even in the laboratory, force it to become something non-bacteria? I don't think you can. I don't think anybody ever has. See, science is something that deals with things we can observe, study, and test. We observe dogs produce dogs. You imagine dogs came from a protista. That's not science. And I, for one, am sick and tired. You say the reason it's taught is because, you know, that's what everybody believes. That's majority opinion argument. They could do that in North Korea or Iran or any totalitarian system. Okay, well, the limit is, obviously there are mechanical limits, there are chemical limits, there are observational limits. Nobody's ever seen this. Could we get a frog that could jump 3 feet? Maybe. Could we get a frog that could jump 5 miles? No. There's a limit. You guys will not admit there are limits. Anyway, I enjoy doing these. You can check our website, drdino.com, or visit our Dinosaur Adventureland. We got a bunch of people working here today at Dinosaur Adventureland in the roaring metropolis of Lenox, Alabama. And watch our YouTube channel, Kent Hovind Official, where we want to help strengthen your faith in the Word of God. Snake, you're going to stand before God one day, whether you believe it or not. I want to tell you, Jesus loves you. He died for you on the cross. He's willing to forgive you if you'd like. If you don't want to, okay, you go face God any way you want. I don't want to face God with a list of my sins. I want him to say, you're forgiven. You can have the same thing. Give me a call sometime, extension 3, Dr. 855 Big Dino. I'll lead you to Jesus right over the phone. Thanks so much.
All right, 9-minute Q&A now, guys. So I think Standing for Truth has been compiling questions.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we got time for just a few questions here. Thanks again, gentlemen, for a lively discussion. And always thanks for giving us your time for these debates. I'll get right into it then. I'll start with a question for Snake. Snake, this question is from Landon Freeman. What levels of biological intelligence and intricacy would cause you to doubt that they evolved through naturalistic means?
If there was some sort of specific purpose to the things, it doesn't seem, I don't think there is really. I don't think complexity is a convincing argument for design. I think if you showed me a creation event, then I would believe it. But complexity, I already know that there are systems that complexity that emerges from natural processes interacting. So the closest you could get me to do is just kind of temporarily doubt for a specific process. If it was extremely complex, I'm thinking of, you know, how would you distinguish between a machine and a life form? And it's hard to pin down, but I think there's a reason in the clock analogy, like finding a stopwatch on the beach. There's a reason people point to the watch and not the sand. See, the sand is also a complex structure that has formed from natural processes. No one can point to a sand particle and say that was obviously designed, but you can point to a watch and say that it's obviously designed. And partially that's because we know where watches come from. We already have that knowledge. But I think you could find some sort of criteria based on its purpose or function as an inanimate object. So a watch doesn't do anything except for the designer and for people who purchase it. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything. It just decays. So if you found self-replicating, I think that would be
okay, awesome. And I think for these questions, we can allow a few second response from the other participant, the other debater on both sides, unless you want to just move on to the next.
I'd just like to say sand itself is incredibly complex. If you look at most of its quartz, I think a large percentage of it is quartz. Look at the quartz, the way the molecules line up with each other, the way the atoms of even quartz and sand, silicon oxide, each atom has electrons whizzing around. Do they ever get tired? Is this perpetual motion? Do the electrons ever get tired? Have they been whizzing around for billions of years with just the design of an atom? Ought to say, wow, there's a designer. To think that a quartz crystal or a piece of sand, start with a jar of nothing and make a grain of sand. Let me see you make a grain of sand from nothing. Just one grain. We got mountains of it here on our property. It's an old gravel pit. Sand is complex. Now, a watch, way beyond sand. But sand is indeed incredibly complex. So I think the arguments had to be a designer, even of sand. I can look at this ink pen and say, there's different parts to this pen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, probably 10 different parts. All of them designed to fit into each other to work to make an ink pen. I'd be a fool to say this pen happened by chance for no reason. I think you're a fool to say the human body happened by chance for no reason. It's way more complicated than an ink pen, and this we would all recognize as impossible. And your argument that ink pens don't reproduce, I think, is insane to say that because that's going to add complexity to the problem, not subtract it. But anyway, you believe what you want.
Well, I don't say there are no reasons.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen, for your answers. So next question is for Dr. Hovind. This one asks, some evolutionists say gene duplication can add new information resulting in limitless changes. Is this true?
I don't think it's ever been demonstrated that a mutation adds new information. It scrambles existing information. If I scrambled up English letters in a sentence, could I ever make a Chinese word? No. You're never going to make a Chinese word with English letters. You're not going to add any new information by scrambling existing information. At least it's never been observed. You can imagine it if you want. That's all they do is imagine it. It's evolution is SpongeBob religion is all it is. It's hilarious that people believe it. Grown men really believe that stuff. I find it hilarious.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that answer, Dr. Hovind. We've got this question for, let me see here. This one.
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So a scrambling of information is still new information. I don't understand where this argument is. And some of the scrambles will actually confer a different meaning. Like I have a whole list of sentences that you can do that to. Just so with a single word, you can replace a letter and it'll just be a different word. So new sequences are new information.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen. So this question here is for Snake. Isn't your lactose and HIV examples just epigenetic regulation and not actual addition of genes or information? Go ahead.
I'm not sure about the lactose, but I don't think so because it's actually an enzyme is produced, so that wouldn't be epigenetic. As far as HIV resistance goes, that is also a protein that's produced. But epigenetic changes are still changes in information.
Okay, are you done with that question then?
Yeah. Unless there was another part to it.
Nope, that's it. Unless
Okay.
Dr. Hovind has a follow-up, I can go on to the last question.
No, go ahead. I think it's obvious these changes are limited and that nobody's ever observed it produce any new information that then takes over the population. Because now you got to get not only the male getting the new information, but the female. And the problems are multitude for his belief. I do admire his faith, though. Go ahead.
Okay, this is the last question. It is directed at Snake, therefore, if Dr. Hovind wants to respond as well, and then that will conclude the question and answer. So this question is from Nephilim Free, and he also put a clarification here. So I'll read it word for word. If information, algorithms, and linguistics are present in DNA, and if information, algorithms, and linguistics originate only from intelligence, wouldn't that be empirical evidence that all life is designed? And his clarification is, notice I am not asking whether or not you believe DNA actually possesses information, algorithms, and linguistics. I only want to know if their presence in DNA would prove DNA is a product of intelligence. Go ahead, Snake.
So I just wanted to clarify that the human resistance to HIV is due to a gene deletion. As for Nephilim's question about linguistics and DNA, I did make a video response to his challenge on that. I don't know if he saw that, but essentially have a stop codon, a start codon, and up and down regulation are not linguistic properties. So I don't see any linguistic properties in DNA, and even if there were, that doesn't, some kind of algorithm does not indicate a design, because we already see natural processes. They all work according to algorithms. But again, that you can assume that the entire universe and even the first cell were created by God. That doesn't say anything about the process of evolution. Yeah. I think,
Okay.
was there a second part of that question?
No, he was just, the second part was more so just a clarification of what he was asking, unless you have something to respond to, Dr. Hovind.
No, that's great. I think his statement that HIV was a gene deletion is interesting. That's like saying, if a person if they're handcuffing everybody to haul them to prison, but somebody's born with no arms, he can't be handcuffed. Oh, that's beneficial. No, it's not. It's beneficial for the moment, maybe, but in the long term, it's a loss of information. That's what I said at the beginning. Even the HIV example he gave was a loss of information, not a gain. His claim was that the mechanism that powers evolution is a gain of new information. He didn't give one. So I agree. DNA has algorithms. DNA is mind-boggling in its complexity. It can't happen by chance. They can believe it if they want, but that's not science. It's SpongeBob.
No one claims it happens by chance, except for creationists.
So these mutations happen on purpose?
The mutations happen by chance, but selection is not chance. The environment is not chance.
But the mutations happen by chance. So the new information comes by chance, is what you're saying, and then natural selection selects that one to be better, to survive.
It's a random production of new information, and yeah, so that's the whole process of evolution is not random.
I would say it's a random process of scrambling information, and most of them, when the information is scrambled too badly, they don't survive even to be conceived, let alone born or grow up and reproduce. So if the information...
You'd need 100% for your claims to hold water, because if even one makes it through, then that's a change. That will
well, the odds of one improved one are 1 in 100 trillion or whatever it is. But again, you got to have two of the opposite sex in the same place at the same time. What if the male and female evolved this difference, but they're 50 miles away and they never find each other, or one's 30 years earlier and they never find each other?
That's also a misconception. You could gene with only one parent.
No, the new improved gene has to be passed on through either asexual or sexual reproduction. So yeah, you got. I think you got.
Only one parent requires that gene.
I'm sorry, what?
Only one parent requires that gene to show up in the child.
So is it possible if one parent had a beneficial mutation that it would be lost in the next generation because it was, the child gets the dominant and recessive characteristics? Can the recessive one ever be simply weeded out?
Yeah, that happens all the time, but there are also dominant genes.
There you go. Thank you, sir.
Time. Sorry, guys, I was a little late. I just let it keep going.
Okay, well, thanks so much again, gentlemen. That was a great debate. Thanks for giving us your time, Snake and Dr. Hovind. Unless you guys want to say just a couple words in goodbye, maybe advertise your channels, we can call it a day.
Yeah, what's your channel, Snake, and what's your goal? What are you trying to do with this channel?
I was trying to essentially explore science, explore critical thinking. I've touched on politics a little bit. But right now I'm kind of focused on creationism, and I've done a flat earth thing, and I saw Kent's flat earth video. I thought that was pretty funny. Maybe I'll call in and we'll talk about how the similarities between flat earth and creationism sometime.
I think we should talk about the similarities between flat earth and evolution. That's where the similarities come in.
I don't see a single one.
I'm sure you don't. No, I'll help you see them.
Hey everybody, today we are debating on the origin of species, and we are starting right now. Thanks for coming, everybody. We are stoked to have you. This is going to be a lot of fun as we debate on the origin of species, and we have two gentlemen here tonight who are going to debate with their hearts and gusto in the debate to the highest extent. And the reason I say that is because you all know Standing for Truth. A lot of you, you're even like, just Standing for Truth, he drives me crazy. We understand that. That's okay. That's normal, friends. Basically, I'm teasing you, Standing for Truth. We love you, buddy. We're glad you're here. And Snake was right. Snake was right, also has energy, he's got gusto, he's excited to jump into it, and we appreciate that. He's got passion. So, likewise, just want to mention, you guys may remember or may not remember our good friend. He hasn't been on the show in quite a while, but we're just extremely enthusiastic and excited to have him, to say the least. Do you guys remember Samuel? So, you guys should hopefully be able to see Samuel on the bottom right. He is our co-moderator for the night. Do you remember when Samuel debated Pelagia? Basically, that was in the fall. That was our second debate ever that we hosted, and it was rocking. It was off the charts. So just want to say, Samuel, how you doing, buddy? Welcome back to the channel.
Hi, James. Glad to be here as always, and certainly looking forward to this one. It can't get more exciting than creation and evolution.
Absolutely. So you'll notice with Samuel is that, man, I don't know if I've seen anybody smile more than Samuel. He's just filled with joy, and so I think you're gonna love him, people. If this is your first time meeting him, you definitely will love him. So with that, just gonna mention a quick couple of house cleaning type things that we're pumped up about in the future. One is, you've probably heard by now, in case you haven't, you have to hear about the debate on God's existence, which is this Wednesday. 2 days from now, we're going live at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Mike Jones, the man behind Inspiring Philosophy, as well as Tom Jump, who is over at the Non Sequitur show tonight. Tom is a formidable debater. He's the dark horse. Nobody knew a lot about him coming in. He was kind of like, who's this Tom Jump guy? And it was like, whoa, this Tom Jump guy can debate. This guy is well read, and he's got a great working memory. Namely, he can juggle a lot of information at once. He's a great debater. So that's going to be an epic showdown. As well as, we just booked this one. We're very excited about it. This is Kent Hovind from Dr. Dino Creation Ministry has agreed to debate Dr. Cy Gart, the biochemist from BioLogos. That's going to be off the charts as they debate our science and religion at war. So we hope that you're able to make it to that. It's going to be a blast. And now let's introduce the debaters. So Standing for Truth has been here before. He is a provocateur. He's got energy, and want to let you know, everybody, the gentlemen's links are in the description right now for you to check them out. So like I said, even if you see Standing for Truth and you're just like, oh, I can't take it, don't worry. He's going to grow on you. If you check out his link, you'll say, hey, I kind of like him. And Snake was right. Also, we got to email, and he's a really friendly guy, and I love his passion, his gusto. I think you're going to enjoy him too. So please check out both of their links, because hey, worst case scenario, even if you don't agree, you at least heard them from them themselves. You didn't hear a summary of them or a straw man, even worse. You got to hear their case straight from them. So with that, we're just going to give Standing for Truth and Snake Was Right a chance to share about what they've been up to on their channel. So maybe in about 30 to 60 seconds, Standing for Truth, if you want to share what you've been up to at your channel. Thanks for coming on tonight, buddy.
Well, thanks so much, James. I appreciate your energy as well. I appreciate your zeal. Your channel's great. I can't stop recommending it. It's amazing. You're putting on some really good shows, some really good debates. Nothing too crazy going on my channel, just typical discussions, videos, some good discussions coming up as well. So if anyone's interested, click away, subscribe. That'd be awesome. But I'm really looking forward to this. Taylor and I have had a couple back and forth discussions already. So if anyone wants to check those out, especially if they feel that this debate here was engaging and exciting, I'd recommend that. But other than that, thanks Samuel, thanks James, and thanks Taylor.
You bet. Oh, it's our pleasure to have you. And it's also our pleasure to have Snake Was Right. Taylor, thanks for coming on tonight, buddy. What have you been up to at your channel?
Well, I made a few videos here a couple years ago, and then recently I just jumped right back in with some of this creationist stuff. So I'm interested in a lot of topics on debate, so hopefully I'll see you around discussing lots of different things.
Yeah, you bet. Well, you're always welcome. I've got to tell you, folks, Taylor was so passionate that I think I caught him he was debating already in the live chat with people before coming on here. I was like, Taylor, you could debate them later. But we're thankful to have a guy here who's got such passion and vigor, is that he's getting into it with Nephilim 3. Neph, he has a way of drawing people. So we love your gusto. Snake Was Right. You got an enthusiasm for it, so we appreciate that. And we are going to kick off the moderating duties to Samuel now in terms of the timing and scheduling for this format. So he's going to just explain the format for you, and then he's going to get the debaters started, and then I'm going to try to catch up on questions that have already come in for the Q&A. So Samuel, passing it over to you. Thanks for being here, buddy.
Indeed, truly a pleasure, James, and thanks for allowing me to participate in this. I'm truly looking forward to this. The format today will involve a 12-minute opening from both sides, which will begin first with Standing for Truth, and then we'll have an opening statement from Taylor, Snake Was Right, and then we will from there proceed on to a 10-minute rebuttal period, followed with a 20-minute discussion. This will not be the typical cross-examination, but indeed there's a free discussion. I will jump in if and when necessary, but otherwise it'll be really good to hear both these gentlemen just discuss with each other on both the opening and the rebuttal period what was brought up. And finally, we'll have a 5-minute closing section, closing presentation from both sides, and then we'll be, of course, passing it back to James for the Q&A. I understand there will be between 20 to 30 minutes for that. So with no further delay, let's head on first to Standing for Truth. The time begins when you start with your opening statement.
Well, I'm just going to share my my screen and make sure that, because I think James has to make sure that's good to go.
Just hooked you up, buddy.
Awesome. So we can see the screen then?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, well, let's get this party started, guys. Origins debate, biblical creation versus evolution, fairy tales of the evolutionist, chemical evolution, for example. You know, that origin of the first living cell from simpler non-living chemicals. This type of chemical evolution has absolutely zero empirical scientific evidence for support, but we're going to be talking about the origin of species today, bacteria to biologist evolution. biological evolutionary theory, the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms. Now, GUDU evolution, Taylor here, he's going to have to explain to us how the four-dimensional genome with multiple overlapping codes and chock full of meta information came about. There is no human information system that can even begin to compare to the multi-dimensional genome. The genome set of instructions is not a simple linear array of letters. It's a dynamic, self-regulating, and it's multi-dimensional, as I've explained. Now, pawns come to people evolution. It's pure imagination. The evolutionists, they hope, they dream, they imagine. It's science. It's empirical science to say that dogs produce dogs, but it's not science to say that dogs, pine trees, bacteria, and whales are related. Evolutionists imagine that mutations make something new and better. Evolutionists imagine that all these small-scale variations will eventually add up to make something we don't actually observe. Time is the hero for the evolutionists. Evolutionists imagine that time can solve all their problems. I say evolution's a religion because time is their god. If I told you that Superman could fly quickly through the air, you'd say that's silly. But if I told you Superman could fly slowly through the air, you'd say that's more believable, maybe even more scientific. If I told you that Mary Poppins could fly quickly through the air with her umbrella, you'd say that's a fairy tale. That's crazy. But if I told you Mary Poppins could fly slowly through the air with her umbrella, you'd say that's not a fairy tale. Superman flying through the air, Mary Poppins flying through the air, and a single-celled organism evolving into a whale are all fairy tales at the end of the day. Grandpa, like I said, evolutionists hope, they dream, they imagine. Now, for example, here's some of their fanciful imagination going on. In Discover magazine, was your ancestor a sea sponge? Now, evolutionists, they'll hide their science fiction-based religion under the disguise of empirical science. We know better than that, don't we? The evolutionists actually publish this type of nonsense. You'd think that they'd be somewhat embarrassed, at least, to publish something like this. Nope, they're actually proud. The evolutionists and SpongeBob themselves should go start a private school together where they can convince others that dogs and banana plants are related. Now, let's get to the biblical based model, because it's just too close for comfort for evolutionists. And evolutionists won't even dispute this data, because if we only started with 2 people, all the people today should have a low genetic diversity based on the biblical record of Adam and Eve. And if we started with millions of people, opposite of what the Bible records, you're going to have a lot of genes floating around, a population of, say, 1 million strong. But if you only started with 2 people, Adam and Eve, that restricts the diversity today. If the Bible is correct, which I am arguing for, and Adam is our ancestor, there should only be 1 male ancestor of humanity. The mitochondrial DNA, it's a little piece of DNA inherited from our mothers, exclusively from our mothers. We can build a family tree of all the females in the world, and there should only be 1 female ancestor. If evolution is true, these don't have to be true. And we know that Eve was taken from Adam, and so most genes should come in 2 versions. And this is exactly what we find. This is exactly what we know to be true, and completely consistent with a biblical-based model. The Bible itself, as recorded in Genesis, predicted this thousands of years ago. Now, it's about defining terms when it comes to evolution, because creationists believe in change, and we would even agree that biological evolution means a change in allele frequency in populations over time, but it's about that type of change. Now, we would say that mutations themselves are destruction and not actually construction. And neo-Darwinism lacks incredible explanatory power in regards to the origin of phenotypic complexity, anatomical novelty, and the origin of non-gradual modes of transition, aka abrupt fossil appearance. Now, like I said, we predict change. Species are not static, and neither are their genomes. Species change over time, and sometimes in pre-planned, non-random pathways. This can even occur through pre-existing algorithms. Changes could occur through homologous crossover, even jumping genes, ALUs, for example, and of course by other mutation-related means. Now, we look to the created heterozygosity hypothesis because according to God's command to be fruitful and multiply, we wouldn't expect God to have wanted that to be carried out through cloning. That wouldn't make any sense. So we believe that, and we're hypothesizing that God created Adam and Eve and the original created kinds with pre-existing functional DNA differences. And if you have these heterozygous ancestors, an almost limitless variety of combinations of chromosomes, genes and traits are possible, but it's not just by mutation, because in the biblical creation model, recombination and gene conversion would provide many new varieties of combination of traits quickly, since the differences, as I've said, are already built in. It's pre-existing genetic diversity. So visible distinctiveness based on this pre-existing functional DNA differences encoded at the start by God, offspring would be rapid. These design variants, though, they would be expected to be created within useful linkage groups, of course, and they would originate at high allelic frequencies. And the inbuilt alternatives God put into Adam and Eve, they're scrambled over time. Picture shuffling a deck of cards, and new traits might arise during this process. But most importantly, this hypothesis makes testable and falsifiable predictions. Evolutionists, they're somewhat confused because evolutionists have treated two very different phenomenon, adaptation to environments and evolution of higher life forms, as if they were the same thing. It doesn't take a genius to see that these are different issues. Adaptation can routinely be accomplished by loss of information. The development of higher life forms, on the other hand, always requires a large increase in net information. We predict based on the design model and nested hierarchies and even mosaic creatures, because we look to the fact that we are made in God's image, and we can get a sense for what kinds of design patterns God might have used by studying and examining the patterns that result from human designs. As I've shown, genetics confirms the biblical creation. We look to the three major haplogroups that indicate after the flood, Noah's three daughters-in-law, which would have, if we look, it's three independent lines of evidence that fit exactly what we see in mitochondrial DNA. The history of humanity based on this phylogenetic tree is in our genome. What we know about mitochondrial DNA of human fits the 6,000-year timescale, explains the three haplogroups and the relative differences, DNA differences between pre and post-flood humanity. Now, junk DNA, functionality versus non-functionality, that's a prediction that creationists have always made, and that's a prediction based on the fact that we only understand less than 5% of the genome that we are making based on pre-existing heterozygosity. And the gold standard of functional testings, gene knockout tests, very little of it has been performed on humans, on mammals. It's unethical. So that's a prediction we're making right now. Now, a big part of our model would actually be, of course, death, degeneration, and extinction. That's what we would predict based on the fall. Now, we have a genome of 3 billion letters. If you take out one letter or change one letter randomly, are you going to have a huge fitness effect? It's going to have a tiny fitness effect. But in fact, it's like rust on a car. You can't see each rust event, but it's continuous and destructive. Moderator, how much more time do I have, brother?
You have you used up 8.5 minutes already. So okay. Yeah,
awesome.
That's, yeah.
Now, the question is, the downward curves, are they real? Because selection happens on the level of the whole organism. And it's absolutely evident based on all the empirical evidence that mutation selection cannot stop the loss of genomic information. So mutations in natural selection clearly cannot create genomes. Selection cannot stop the loss of information that is incredibly and immeasurably complex due to low impact deleterious mutation accumulation, which is happening on the molecular level. It's like trying to fix a computer with a hammer. It's just not going to happen. And this is what we predict under a literal interpretation of Genesis, the biblical based model. Evolutionists are just going to have to keep on imagining. Now, picture this. We're all a mutant. We transmit a small amount of mutations to our children. Even the evolutionists will admit that. 100 new mutations per person per generation, and genomes are devolving, and the genome is rusting out like a car. Take a room full of people. Now kill off the most mutant people. Now we have a room half full of people who still have approximately 100 more mutations than their parents. If everybody is multiply mutant, and if every generation is more mutant than the one before it, all selection can do is slow down the degeneration by killing off the absolute worst of the lot. But it doesn't stop mutations from accumulating in the population over time. Things are going down, not up. All modern scientific evidence points to the decay and destruction of an originally perfect design / creation. This is exactly what we predict based on a biblical-based model. Now, we're going to have to get into beneficial mutations because for numerous reasons that I'm going to get into, beneficial mutations cannot sufficiently compensate for the relentless influx of deleterious mutations. Based on the fact that we know the Bible records a time when people had extremely long lives, we can take this genetic entropy, this accumulation of mutations, to a point of least genetic entropy, which would be a point of creation and a point when people lived to these extremely long lives. Now, Taylor here is going to have to explain a way and how natural selection and beneficial mutations can counterbalance the accumulating mutations, because due to the influx of deleterious mutations, the rare occurrence of beneficial mutations cannot compensate for the information loss, of course, and the linkage itself is only going down. It's only getting worse and worse. It's only getting degenerate. Beneficials are
1
rare.
minute left.
Thank
1
you.
minute left.
Beneficials are rare, and I imagine Taylor is going to agree with me on this. And natural selection would be severely constrained by what's called selection interference, which we can get into more later, of course. But the problem is we now know that beneficial mutations are very rare, and non-neutral mutations are consistently deleterious, as anybody should expect with typographical errors in a text. So the best beneficial mutations, and I want to see an example of a mutation that adds new, novel, and meaningful information, because most of them are reductive. And information loss is not going to take, of course, your fish to fisherman. So the bottom line is both evolutionists and creationists, they agree natural selection happens. Natural selection will only improve the worst, will remove the worst deleterious and detrimental mutations, and will only amplify the very best beneficial mutations. What does this indicate and suggest? The accumulating damage is largely invisible and unselectable. So it comes down to net gain versus net loss, and everything we know about genetics, everything we know about empirical data, proves biblical creation and disproves pawns come to people evolution. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you there, Standing for Truth, for that 12-minute opening. Now we'll just reset the clock, and the time will start for your opening statement. Snake was right, Taylor, when you're ready.
All right, thanks. So this is a fact in this field of biology, that with all these problems that Standing for Truth is bringing up, they're actually under study right now. And young Earth creationists basically take advantage of this gap in knowledge and assert that this is where their God resides. And it's the typical God of the gaps argument. And evolution is simply just the change of species populations through the generations. And every creationist, even the young Earth creationists, agree with this. They might not agree with this definition, but everyone agrees that change happens through species populations over the generations. We all agree that genes encode phenotypic traits, and we all agree that each generation can incrementally push populations to create branching populations with different traits. Evolution does not address how life began, only how it changes. And so the point of actual contention between us and the young Earth creationists is actually what is the original kind that we're dealing with that evolution describes the change of. Because evolution assumes a pre-existing living organism, or at least one organism, but probably a population of organisms. So the theory of evolution actually leaves ample room for this idea that God created all the animals on Earth, but they have to step outside the biblical literalist translation, because if you stay with the scientific community, then you're going to have to admit that the world is billions of years old and that we can trace our ancestry back to very simple organisms. And that's something that they want to try to avoid. See, young Earth creationists claim that life is extant in most of their present forms and have evolved into subspecies since this recent creation event. But normal evolutionists debate that. Well, it's not really a debate anymore, but they hold the view that the Earth took billions of years to evolve life. So, sorry, there's dogs barking. You guys hear that?
That's okay.
All right.
So the young Earth creationists cannot demonstrate with any mechanism how these harmful mutations build up in all cases, and that is their case, because they have to prove that there are no cases in which these mutations are overcome. Because if there's even one case, that means that life can continue on and proliferate and then get another chance at And we actually observe the opposite. We have models that are based on old evolutionary models that do assume that mutations would build up. And based on those models, we actually observe an underdispersion of harmful alleles, where as those old models, which they're outdated because we're actually researching this more and more and more, but the creationists are working with these outdated models. So they expect, rightly, because they're outdated and insufficient models, that we would see more mutations than we do. And but there's actually a well-known paradox, because we predict these things, but we don't see them, meaning we need more research into this. So they essentially just take advantage of this gap in knowledge and to insert their religious worldview. Let's see. And it really, essentially it rests on a giant conspiracy in the sciences against any supernatural explanation. And but that's not what science is. The young Earth creationists try to borrow the term science and appropriate the research to support their scriptures. They're trying to basically appropriate the legitimacy and the weight of the term science, but they don't want to be confined by naturalism or uniformitarianism, which they say is the flaw in science. But that comes along with science. So essentially you see them cherry picking at what they like and what they don't like. And so there's no real principle other than the Bible. And so it's not scientific. Essentially it's the position of trying to have your cake and eat it too. They want to be taken seriously in the scientific community, but they don't want to play by the rules of serious science. They want to explain things with supernaturalism, which would be just as empty and pointless as me saying that I can answer your question on how deleterious mutations accumulate over time by just saying, well, my God waved a magic wand and made them go away. It's not a very satisfying answer for either of us. So it's appealing to your God is essentially just a cop-out. So you don't have to do any of the actual science of connecting your ideas. How much time do I have left?
Well, you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
No, 6 minutes exactly.
Okay. So you can dispute the science all day long, but if you don't agree with naturalism, it's just don't call yourself a scientist. If you think that that's somehow lacking, then don't call yourself a scientist. Come up with something better than science, but so far we really haven't. And all science is a method. So yes, we assume that naturalism and uniformitarianism, because that is the process of science. Those are the premises of science, and you can't separate them. The science is the study of naturalistic processes, and the science works. So therefore, the premises of the science must be true to some degree, and that's how we know that it works. We didn't pick these principles arbitrarily. They're the principles that underlie the methods that work. So that's a huge distinction from just picking a religious text as your principle and using that as a guiding force, whereas we use processes that are self-evidently useful, and then we don't actually appeal to books. We could just compile what we found in them. I think moving on to, let's present some of the data right now. So there's this question of mutation accumulation, and essentially all of the studies that I read that were cited by the creationists, they predict an accumulation of slightly deleterious alleles only under certain conditions, like very small populations, under 1,000 individuals, or under high environmental stochasticity, which basically is just a very unstable environment. And we have several studies confirming basically that this only occurs under certain conditions. And so they haven't met their burden of proof. And even assuming that all slightly deleterious mutations accumulate absolutely with no exception, that doesn't disprove evolution one bit. It may be the case that we accrue mutations over time, and we may have an expiration date eventually, but that doesn't change the fact that genes are changing each generation. And so really, I have a lot of the molecular evidence with me today, but I think I'm going to focus more on the fossil record this time, because personally, that is the most convincing evidence of evolution for me, even though I study the molecular aspects of cells. And that's very convincing to me. But what I can't find any other explanation for that creationists can account for is the fossil record, which is layered in such a way that we actually see simple organisms only at the bottom, and layering all the way to the top, we see these organisms, we see the populations change. So we don't actually see individual organisms, or we don't witness every single transitional step. But what we see is a population on one layer and a population on the next layer, and they're slightly different, but also very different. But the populations look similar, but they also look different. So we can go up and up and up and up the ladder, and what we see at the top is a lot of species that we don't find anywhere at the bottom. And what we find on the bottom is incremental steps as you follow it up the way that appear as if they're changing into all of our modern species. And so evolution essentially is an attempt to just explain what is the cause of biodiversity. So I think we basically agree on that evolution exists. What we're going to have to be debating tonight is whether or not the original forms that evolution concerns, how they changed into what we know today.
50 seconds.
We're going to have to, how much?
50 seconds.
Okay. We're going to have to figure out what that original form was, because evolution actually assumes working cellular mechanisms, all of that stuff that is supposedly so mind-bogglingly complex that it could never have arisen naturally, but that is a separate question. And by the way, those mechanisms are different in most cells, so there's actually a lot of flexibility and variability in that as well. But yeah, I guess that will end my opening statement.
One thing,
All right.
Samuel, forgive me for jumping in really quick. I just wanted to mention, I forgot to mention at the start, if anybody has a question, feel free to put it into the live chat. If you put in @ModernDayDebate at the start of your question, that'll make it highlighted for me, so it'll be a little bit easier for me to pull it out in case we've got all these other questions for people that are debating in the live chat. And also, if this is your first time here, feel free to subscribe. We'd love to have you come back. We are shooting for ideological diversity. So whether you're a Christian, atheist, you believe in evolution, creation, whatever it is, we're glad you're here, and we welcome you to be a part of the community. So with that, Samuel, thanks for your patience, and debaters, thanks for your patience for when I jumped in there. And last thing, we're new to the super chat thing. If you have a super chat, super chats, we will put you at the front of the list during the Q&A for your question or comment. And it also, as mentioned, allows you to do a comment towards one of the debaters from which they would respond to. So if you'd like to do that, that's an open option as well. And again, thanks for your patience and letting me cut in, guys.
No problem at all, James. Well, thank you both for that opening statement that both of you provided. We are now going to go into the rebuttal period. We'll begin with Standing for Truth with a 10-minute rebuttal period. I'll just, once again, 1 minute to time, I'll just indicate by just saying 1 minute, if that's all right with both of you. Standing for Truth, your 10-minute rebuttal period starts as soon as you start.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much there, Taylor. I appreciate your opening there. You know what? We have met the burden of proof. 12,000 new deleterious mutation-related diseases are added every year to the database. That's obviously empirical evidence for this genome-wide degradation, because we see genetic entropy in real time. Alzheimer's disease, dementia, autism, asthma, autoimmune, cancers, immunological. There's a pandemic, and a lot of it is also based on epigenetic mutation. That means we're seeing entropic degeneration on all levels. And it's a fact that 700 billion mutations are accumulated this generation alone, 100 per person per generation. And that's 7 billion people on the planet, and most mutations are obviously in the non-selection zone. I mean, we see it in bacteria, we see it in paleogenomic evidence, we see it in mammoth populations carried a very high genetic load. Neanderthals were 40% less fit than modern humans. Homo naledi, the Hobbit, reductive evolution is seen in bacteria. I mean, it's just genome-wide degradation in all types of life, even in viruses. The H1N1 went from a red-hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event in only 90 years. This is genetic degeneration at work here. And he brought up the fossils as evidence as well. And the thing is, I brought forth testable and falsifiable predictions. And bones found in the dirt, bones are not inherited, traits are. That's why we look to genetics. Genetics on all levels proves biblical creation. I mean, the LMN haplogroups, 3 major haplogroups that fit exactly what we'd expect given a literal interpretation of Genesis. Low genetic diversity shows us that we all came from 2 people, Adam and Eve. And the Darwinists, like Taylor here, they cite the circumstantial evidence of fossils of what they call, say, transitional forms as proof of common descent, or just the layering of the fossils. But this type of evidence, it's just circumstantial evidence because it doesn't have an actual theory to cling to. And these apparent progressions, for example, that they bring up in the fossil record are, of course, predicated on the assumption of universal common descent, and based on our model of built-in genetic diversity, this built-in capacity of animals to adapt independently to different environmental situations, perhaps even in a similar way to the finches that diverged from a single parental stock. We'd expect this biodiversity seen in the fossil record based on pre-existing heterozygosity, and the flood itself explains the fossil record. What we really see in the fossil record, the vast majority of fossils from top to bottom, is marine fossils. It's 98% marine fossils, and they're mixed with land fossils. We find clams mixed with birds, mixed with horses, in all different strata. So the vast majority of fossils in the record are marine, exactly expected given what we know about the Genesis flood. We see, the evidence of animals running from the floodwaters. We even find animal tracks before we find the actual animals. And that's hard enough for the evolutionists to explain. The flood waters come in, recede slowly, gradually, burying organisms in their habitat, slowly building and progressing its way up. Mostly in the upper layers, what we see, though, is post-flood diversification and dispersion, which is obviously readily explainable through land bridges, floating mats. During the ice ages, birds distributing plants and other materials. Animals can be distributed around in very natural means during cataclysmic events. So, like I said, bones found in the dirt, they're not inherited, traits are. And the thing is, he talked about change in species. I agree that there's going to be change. We predict change based on our model of pre-existing functional DNA differences, of course, and a change in allele frequency in populations over time, all you want. What do we know? Dogs produce dogs. That doesn't mean that dogs and whales are related through common ancestry, because we need to see how that information can be built up to get your single cell to multi-cell to fish to amphibian to reptile to mammal to bird to monkey to man. I mean, there's going to be required phenomenal increases in expansion of genetic information. And the thing is, he looked to certain conditions, whether it's large populations, Just looking at my notes here, population thresholds to explain away the accumulation of these low impact deleterious mutations. But like I showed in my opening, natural selection is obviously only selecting between mutant and more mutant. If we're all multiply mutant, the thing is all natural selection can do is slow down the degeneration process, and a few rare beneficial mutations is not going to actually counterbalance the information loss. We see information loss on all levels, and we can't make the noise because there's too much genetic noise. We can't make the noise go away by invoking larger population sizes. Actually, one thing I had written down was naturalism. He has a naturalism bias. He even admitted it, and he even admitted himself that he has his own God of the gaps, because they're just studying this evidence and yet they can't actually resolve it. I mean, they have rescue mechanisms like synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism, but it's all in the imagination. This type of evolution, Ponce scum to people evolution, only happens in the imagination of those that actually want to believe in it, because we see degeneration, death, decay of not only the universe is winding down, and we can point that back to a point of least entropy, a point of creation, as Genesis tells us, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, but also on a genomic level. And this genetic noise, it's always present and at much higher levels than is normally acknowledged by population geneticists. And all population geneticists, whether evolutionary or creationist, acknowledge the degeneration problem, and it's consistent with our model. And even if he wants to look to larger populations, different conditions, genetic noise destroys that, because very large populations invariably have enhanced noise, and larger population sizes extend over a wider range of environments, of course. So that means they're going to be subject to even more environmental variation and environmental pressures, negative pressures. And noise always remains a severe constraint to natural selection. Obviously, Taylor's talked about before in our previous discussions about artificial conditions, plant and animal breeding, for example. And yes, these breeders have been able to, very successfully select for a limited number of traits. And this is done through means of intelligence, which can minimize noise. But natural selection does none of this, and is nothing more than a blind and uncontrolled process subject to unconstrained noise and unlimited random fluctuation. So the no selection box, these near neutral unselectables, they build up in the population and they cannot be waved away by the evolutionists. That's why the evolutionists imagine it's pseudoscience, because they don't have any testable predictions on these low impact near neutral deleterious mutations that are accumulating in our genome. And even by invoking larger population sizes, it's still going to show high levels of biological noise. So there's no rescue there. And evolution is all about rescue devices, convergent evolution, just rescue device after rescue device. And even junk DNA, these non-coding areas, and evolutionists will often tell you that 20% max is functional, but ENCODE themselves found that at least 80% of the non-coding DNA was transcribed into RNA, suggesting function. And this is our testable prediction, because the trajectory of discovery now favors genome-wide functionality. And this non-coding DNA, it functions much like a computer. It's involved in regulatory functions, embryonic development, timings of protein manufacture, but comprehensive knockout experiments, as I said in my opening, for a mammal have yet to be performed. So it's premature to make the claim that the majority of non-coding DNA is functional, but we're predicting that the vast majority is functional. And that's how we're going to identify the created kinds that he's talking about, because we're going to look for functionally unique differences across families if we're looking to the family level to identify kinds. So it's all about the testable predictions that actually flow from the hypothesis. And if we're looking to a family, we can see in orphan genes, taxonomically restricted genes, we can see that this actually disproves common ancestry.
1 minute.
In of itself. He's going to have to show me actual examples of beneficial mutations that are not deleterious in any way, because at the end of the day, if it comes down to a net loss versus a net gain of information, and all known examples of beneficial mutations are involving decay of prior information. I mean, even gene duplications, a few rare, say, beneficial duplications, they're not going to offset the many accumulating deleterious duplications, let alone all the other accumulating mutations. So it's all about a net loss versus a net gain, and most beneficials are reductive, and things are obviously not being taken forward. They're actually degrading. And this type of pond scum to people evolution it's impossible. I didn't see a model being put forth. I didn't see any of even evolution as best evidence, whether it's nested hierarchies, phylogenetic systematics, pseudogenes, genetic markers.
5 seconds.
So hopefully he can bring some of that up, because I've made testable predictions. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Standing for Truth, for that rebuttal period. Now we'll just head over to Snake for Right. Just a second while I reset the clock. Your time starts as soon as you start speaking.
All right. I'm not sure what testable predictions he's talking about. If the biblical model were true, what we would see from the flood event is essentially everything all mixed up in the same level. We wouldn't see different layers with different populations. We'd expect everything to be buried in a single layer and evenly distributed. And I don't know if anyone else caught this, but he said that 90% of the fossils are marine animals, and that just does not comport with the biblical model at all. If 90% of the animals that died in the flood were marine, it just doesn't make sense. They can swim. They live in the water. So most of the animals would have to have been terrestrial animals. And in the case of a global flood, I don't know how long it's supposed to have lasted. I don't think over a year. We would not see very many layers, and we would see an even distribution of animals. So that just completely blows out of the water any possible ideation that any young Earth creationist has. But I'm going to go over the rest of the science too, because I think that you're reading it wrong. So first of all, I'm not a Darwinist. Darwinists believe only in natural selection, because Darwin did not have access to genetics. He didn't know anything about them. He didn't know what genes were, anything about that. We are researching a lot of different evolutionary mechanisms now, down to the molecular level, and they're basically taking advantage of this and saying it's a God of the gap situation here, while he's doing the same thing. But what we're doing is we're taking the results that we see. Sorry, guys. We're taking the results that we see, which is that some populations do not accrue deleterious mutations, and we're trying to explain that. And we have a lot of different explanations. We get more all the time. So let's see, I'm gonna try and screen share this time. Okay. Can you see it?
Yep.
All right, so basically what we're dealing with is outdated theories of evolution. So we have this old theory of advantageous mutations are rapidly fixed, disadvantageous are rapidly eliminated, and neutral accumulate. And this evolved into nearly neutral mutations, because we found out that a lot of these things don't have much of a, that these actually are not totally neutral, they have a small effect. There is a paper in here that talks about that most of them are actually, most of the nearly neutral mutations are mutations to regulatory function, and therefore that's why they're nearly neutral, and because they don't have as much of an effect. And so let's see here. Anyway, there are lots of different mechanisms that we do this, so let's go over one of them. This is from a study on epistasis. And so basically what you see here is beyond this red line in all these different samplings, this is loss of function. So all these buildups of genes that you see to the right of the red line, they all die. So what you're left with is these that don't have any. And essentially what this is caused by is a high variance. And essentially that creates a really large distribution to select from. So, and this is caused by the synergistic interactions between these different mutations. So you will actually get some combinations that aren't deleterious at all, some that are barely deleterious, and most of them that will cause loss of function. And beyond the loss of function line, that will be selected out very quickly. But over here, it actually recombines them and has a different effect. And we select for the ones with the least mutations. And so, let's see. But I want to go over the fact that he's using this accumulation of mutations as a red herring, because it doesn't really matter. You can't disprove evolution by saying that mutations accumulate. These changes are still observed and still occur, and so that it doesn't really matter. Let's see here. I'm just gonna go through some of the papers. He says there's no evidence of these things. So this is from the same paper that I just showed you the charts from. It says negative or purifying selection prevents the unlimited accumulation of deleterious mutations and establishes a mutation selection equilibrium. It's from the same paper. The situation becomes quite different if slightly advantageous mutations occur at a constant rate, independent of environmental conditions. In this case, the evolutionary rate can be enormously higher in species with a larger population size than in the species with small population size, contrary to the observed pattern of evolution at the molecular level. There's a paper called Quantifying the Slightly Deleterious Mutation Model of Molecular Evolution, and they found that about 10% or fewer mutations seem to behave as slightly deleterious mutations. So it's really not as big a problem as he tries to make it out, and it doesn't affect whether evolution happens or not. If we're all evolving towards a state of genetic decay, if we're all going to lose function and become disease-ridden, cancerous blobs, that's still evolution. We're still going to see change of population through time. In a paper called Genetic Constraints on Protein Evolution, so the young Earth creationists have this genetic constraint theory where they think that the buildup of deleterious alleles will constrain evolution to just kinds differentiating in, like, a tiger can never, or a cat can never become a non-cat, something like that. From this paper, we see deleterious effects of adaptive mutations are subsequently suppressed through the fixation of compensatory mutations. Typically, suppression occurs within the time frame of the adaptation and often involves multiple compensatory mutations. So not all mutations affect every individual differently, because we all have different mutations. So some configurations are actually going to suppress the effects of other mutations. So we literally have tons of papers talking about this effect. Let's go to the next one. Actually, this is from the same paper. A large portion of positively selected mutations appear to be compensatory, suppressing deleterious pleiotropic effects of adaptive mutation. And pleiotropic is just essentially the synergistic effects between the different mutations. So you're going to have a wide range of variance between these different buildups that are going to have less and more, and you're also going to have a wide variance of the effect that this has on the organism, because each different variant has a different effect on each different organism. So you could have the same mutations as someone, but they might be deleterious for you and beneficial for them.
1 minute.
Okay. I'll skip ahead a little bit. There's a paper called "The Loss of Function of Sarcomeres Saccharomyces," if that's a hard word. Kinesin-related SYN8 and KIP1 is suppressed by CAR3 motor domain protein mutations. So there's just tons of examples of where we actually see mutations making up for other mutations. And I will end with one of his citations about Neanderthal genes introgressing into the human population, and we actually observe a slowed spread of these genes because they were less fit. And so there is actually, we observe that there are cellular mechanisms editing out these deleterious mutations. We don't know quite all of them yet. And so the young Earth creationists—
5 seconds.
And I'll just end there.
Oh, thank you very much, Taylor. Snake was right, and also to Standing for Truth, that intriguing rebuttal period. Now we're going to go to not a cross-examination, but a 20-minute period of open discussion. Now, what I thought I'll do is just start out by maybe just throwing a topic in there, and you guys could pick it up from there if that's all right. So I'll reset the clock to just 20 minutes. Now, of course, remember, for those of you just tuning in, you can, of course, post your questions in, just tag Modern Day Hysteria, and of course, we'll have a Q&A period right after this. But now, the 20-minute discussion period, I'll begin by letting Standing for Truth have the first say, and then you can pick it up from there. The question I want to throw in as an introductory discussion point is that Snake was right, insisted that the fossil record simply demonstrates, kind of proves his point of view, and if the flood really was an explanation to that, you should see one single layer instead of the different layers that we have now in the fossil record. Does that disprove creation? Let's start with you, Standing for Truth.
Sure, I can certainly address that. I appreciate your rebuttal there. It just seems like everything he said was a lot of storytelling, a lot of imagining, because it seems like, according to him, evolution answers up, down, in and out, living, dying, breathing and not breathing. It just answers everything. I mean, we see entropic degeneration on all levels, all this thousands of mutation-related diseases, and yet the fact that beneficial mutations are rare, and obviously they can't make up or compensate for the information loss, it's still evidence for fish to fisherman evolution. So I find that absurd. But in regards to like I said, fossils, bones found in the dirt, they're not inherited traits are. That's why I look to genetics to demonstrate my model. That's why I've made testable predictions. But at the end of the day, if he wants a testable prediction for, the CPT model, the catastrophic plate tectonics model that I look to explain the geology, I mean, I can give him that, since if he's looking specifically for a testable prediction on that. I mean, is that what you're looking for, Taylor?
Not really. Unless that's been approved by mainstream scientists. But I'm really looking more for something that you can predict that will show up in the fossil layer, which everything about the flood predicts that it would look completely different.
Well, the thing is, if you look to Genesis and you look to our actual flood model,
looking to Genesis at all?
But I'm saying that if
your starting point.
We'll let him just answer that, and then of course I'll pass it back to you, Taylor.
Well, the scope and scale of the energy produced by the flood, according to Genesis, would have been astounding. And the fountains of the great deep breaking up, that's what we look to. So the earth is fractured like an eggshell. Continents are moving vertically, horizontally, and tsunamis, they drive floodwaters onto the continents. The rain is unending, and it's just geologic catastrophism. And that's why all these marine fossils that are found, these clams, they're already at the bottom. So that's why we would see 80% of them are consisting of the actual fossil record. But the thing is, this continent, the continental the continents are moving at rapid paces. It's like a sprint. The evolutionists look to continental drift, but we look to initial continental sprint, and it's through the floodwaters and all this geological havoc. But here's the testable prediction we've made on that, because if we don't make a testable prediction, just like I make testable predictions on pre-existing heterozygosity, we also make testable predictions on the CPT model. And the pre-flood ocean crust is dragged down into the mantle. That's called subduction process. So the testable prediction would be that the cold ocean crust should still be cold, since this occurred only thousands of years ago, even though it has descended into the deep hot mantle. Now, what's amazing is that seismic data, and I can give you this article and the audience the article from NASA, has actually revealed enormous slabs of cool rock under North America. And down in the core itself, which should be warm, this is confirmation of the catastrophic plate tectonics model. So all the phenomenon, everything we see fits that basic hypothesis of catastrophic plate tectonics. I'm not sure what else you could be looking for. Go ahead.
But Snake was right. You were saying that why refer to Genesis, right? You can carry that on.
Yeah.
Well, what do you have to say about the testable prediction that I made? Because if I put forth a model based on Genesis, it's pseudoscience if there's no testable predictions that flow from it. But based on the fact that the pre-flood ocean crust is dragged down into the mantle, which is called subduction process, based on the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open. I'm not sure if you've read the account in Genesis of the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, but like I said, the earth is fractured like an eggshell. The continents are moving not only vertically, but horizontally. So seismic data from NASA has revealed this, these enormous slabs of cool rock under North America. So that is a confirmed prediction. But like I said, fossils, bones found in the dirt, they're not inherited. Traits are. So if we're looking at the origins of species, which is the name of this debate, we need to look at what is inherited, and traits are inherited. So, I mean, we can continue talking about, you know, flood geology if you want, but I didn't really see any actual evidence being presented for universal common ancestry. So take your time, address what I said. Curious as to your opinion and thoughts on the testable prediction we've made given a model of catastrophic plate tectonics, but I'd like to see your evidence for the origin of species, not just a random change in allele frequency and populations over time, but actual evidence. Go ahead.
All right.
The evidence is in the fact that every population is different in each layer. We wouldn't see that in a flood model, and we wouldn't see 90% of the death being animals that survive in water.
So that, okay, so you're, see, the thing is, fossils, you know, it's just, I've already given you a testable falsifiable prediction based on our model, catastrophic plate tectonics. So I mean, I don't
not
really
unique though. That's
No,
like predicting that the sun will come up. We
No,
already know that the sun will come up.
No, because that's actually a pretty sufficient prediction and confirmation based on that model. But like I said, I mean, if you're gonna look to the fossil record, and even though it's just circumstantial evidence requiring an actual theory to account for the large scale evolution, but all we see is a net loss of information, and the fact that natural selection is severely constrained by selection interference. I mean, how are you gonna, can you give me a few beneficial mutations that are not somewhat deleterious? I mean, how are you gonna build, because if you're looking to, you know, the lower levels of the simple organisms, and I wouldn't say a trilobite is simple by any means, it's certainly complex, look at the eye, but how are you gonna account for that information buildup? Where's the novelty?
Well, that doesn't actually matter. We can start with, evolution starts with a pre-assembled DNA and cellular mechanism. So we start with genes. So we can just lose information. That's fine. It doesn't matter.
Well, no, because if these beneficial mutations that you agree are rare, and they can seldom make the type of compensation that's needed to stop the net loss of information, you're not gonna, it's like taking 2 steps forward, but then taking 10 steps backward. You're never gonna climb that mountain, and you're never gonna get your fish to fisherman. It's a pseudo-scientific belief, but you can believe in it all you want, Taylor, but I haven't seen any evidence being presented the entire time. You're looking to the fossil record, but bones found in the dirt are not inherited. Traits are. Where's your evidence, genetically speaking? I mean, what do you look to, brother?
You're welcome to check their math, but I just read off to you like 4 or 5 studies where they conclude the exact opposite of what you're saying.
Well, the thing is, you look to, for one, I'll go to, you know, those studies and mechanisms, but where's your example of a beneficial mutation? Because I agree that there are mutations that are beneficial given, you know, and they're environmentally dependent, of course. I mean, even looking at, you know, sickle cell anemia, for example, it's still ultimately reductive, but at the end of the day, there is some type of benefit to be had from it. But where's your novel gain and information there, Taylor? Go ahead.
Well, it's context dependent. Not all mutations are going to cause disease in every individual. And so the fact that there's such high variance is how we get away with it. I talked to you last time we talked. So you still don't understand how gaining an antifreeze function to your blood is a beneficial mutation?
Well, the thing is, I'm not disagreeing with adaptations, and the thing is, it's funny that the only example you can go to is these notothenioid antifreeze Arctic fish, the antifreeze proteins, because all it is a story. They're looking at it, it's already occurred, and they're making judgments and inferences. Where's your real time? And the thing is, you know, it's probably an epigenetic, non-random genetic change. Anyways, these fish go into the cold water, and all of a sudden they have these antifreeze proteins that they develop based on pre-existing genetic adaptation. But where's your actual, you know, observable evidence? Not looking at some story, because I know evolutionists like to imagine and storytell, but you're talking about a trade-off here. You're talking about that it's context dependent, but while the genome is degenerating in all many possible ways, Taylor, and while a few nucleotide sites may be improving, you know, based on this context dependent beneficial mutations, huge numbers are being degraded. So this type of trade-off you're talking about, it's obviously not sustainable, as it's still going to result in a shrinking functional genome size. So once again, you can believe in it all you want, and I put a capital B on believe, but it's just a science fiction based religion with no actual empirical evidence. I mean, you still haven't presented us any evidence. You look to some bones found in the dirt. I've given you a testable falsifiable prediction based on our model of catastrophic plate tectonics. Where's your evidence for Pond scum to people evolution? Go ahead.
Well, you're kind of all over the place here. So most of these mutations are only slightly deleterious because they're regulatory mutations. So I cited you several papers that talk about compensatory mutations. So one mutation can up and down regulate all these weird tinkerings that you had and just solve it all. And Dr. Seigart, when he talked with Nephilim, he brought up how birds were losing eyesight function, and then all of a sudden they got a mutation and everything started working better. And that's part of, there's another paper that examines biological systems with anti-fragility and examines how you can mess with the system and it will still have the same functionality.
Well, the thing is, when you look to redundancy in, say, a computer, you know, this backup code, you look at that and think, wow, what incredible design. But when you look at the redundancy in a genome, and let's say there's a mutation in that redundancy, in that backup code, I mean, of course, it's going to be deleterious, and it's evidence of design. And how does natural selection build something like redundancy, this backup code in the genome, when natural selection looks to the short term, but yet these redundant elements are actually built for the long term? So I don't agree that compensating for loss of information is possible at all, Taylor. I mean, I don't think you've demonstrated
with the science.
Well, the thing is, you're saying
what it all comes down to is your guys' whole argument hangs on a conspiracy in the sciences.
Well, no, it's not a conspiracy, because that's what we see: death, degeneration. We see mutations or destruction, not construction. And the thing is, the whole genome is degenerating and throwing out so much information while trying to make up for it with a few beneficial mutations that you're talking about. That's not going to solve the problem. That's wishful thinking.
We actually see the opposite, and we're trying to explain that.
So you're trying to explain that, and you see the opposite, even though we see entropic degeneration on all level. I mean, 12,000 mutation-related diseases. I mean, where's your beneficial mutations in man? We see thousands of Mendelian-related mutations. Can you even give me one that's not somewhat deleterious? I mean, you're not fooling anybody in believing that losing information is going to build your genome. I mean, it's just not even. It's absurd, to say the least.
Imagine you're playing Scrabble and you have you can spell amazing, and you remove the a Z and an A, and now you have amazing, and it spells something. It's the same thing. You can duplicate letters and you get more stuff to work with.
Well, the thing is, if you're duplicating an already degenerate gene based on the accumulation of these low impact near neutral mutations, you're probably just going to speed up the degeneration process. And the thing is, if I give you a copy of a book that you already own, and the thing is you start introducing typographical errors in that second copy of the book you already own, all you have is a more messed up copy of that original book. So things are not being taken forward, and all we see is devolution. The origin of species is better explained from a creationist, biblical-based model perspective, because we expect change, but we expect change based on information loss, and that's exactly what we see. I mean, I have a paper here that talks about functional DNA making the problem even worse. And the thing is, the evidence for genome-wide functionality is strong. It's preliminary, but the trajectory is strong. But this paper talks about that even if the genome is only 10% functional, evolution is impossible. And I think you would even agree that the genome is more than 10% functional, would you not?
It's probably about 10, maybe more.
Okay, so, well, for one, I think the evidence is outstanding for it being more than, because the thing is, how much do we know about the developmental process, for example, and that
A lot. And it confirms evolution, because on our embryonic stages, we look like our past, we express basically genes that were present phenotypically in adults of our past ancestors.
But the thing is, how does, so tell me, how does coding and non-coding DNA coordinate when, where, and how, you know, these structures are sequentially put in place to produce a fully functional organism? Like, can you explain to me the step-by-step process on a molecular level on how you go, how the coding and non-DNA coding actually coordinate? I mean, they know very little, because a lot of these genes, well, for one, you agreed that, you know, knockout experiments for a mammal have yet to be performed, and yet you're saying that the genome is probably only 10% functional. I mean, isn't that kind of premature, Taylor?
No, it's based on mutation rates. So if mutation rates accumulate in the higher end of realistic levels, then what was the study saying? It basically just says that it's comparing mutation rates with a functional genome. So the higher the functional genome is, the more deleterious effects you'll find from mutation rate. And so we've predicted that there's a functional range of like 10 to 25% based on our ability to basically the breeding rate.
So are you saying that the genome can only be 10% functional, even though ENCODE revealed preliminary data? I'm not saying that it's, you know, 100% evidence, but it is preliminary that at least 80% of the genome is transcribed in RNA. So that at least suggests that the genome's not idle. And the fact that we know very little about the developmental process and how coding and non-DNA coding coordinate with each other. I mean, are you just saying that the genome has to be 10% functional because of this paper that says 10% or more completely destroys pawns come to people evolution? Like, do you, because it seems like that type of belief is going to hinder scientific advancement, because now
no, because we don't make assumptions. We say that it's a prediction, and if it doesn't come true, then we go back to the model. We're researching the stuff, but that doesn't mean we get to go, oh well, just we don't know, therefore God did it. This is science. It constantly we went from the neutral theory of mutation accumulation to the nearly neutral theory, and now we know that they're only low impact, slightly deleterious, because most of these that we're talking about are occurring in the majority of the gene code, which is non-functional.
See, but the thing is, as I talked about earlier, portion
low impact because it's regulatory, and regulatory functions are very easy to up and down regulate with epigenetics, all kinds of different things.
Well, the thing is, ENCODE has actually revealed that most nucleotides play a role in multiple overlapping codes. So contrary to pond scum to people evolution, that actually makes any beneficial mutations, which are not deleterious at some level, vanishingly rare. And as I said earlier, portions of the genome involved specifically in embryological development were not evaluated. So systematic knockout experiments, as we're predicting based on the model of pre-existing heterozygosity, can only fully demonstrate this. So why don't we get into the lab and see which prediction involving the non-coding DNA regions are actually true? Because the thing is, if you're saying that the genome's only 10% functional, which I think that's just false, it's false, flat on its face, because the trajectory is already pointing to genome-wide functionality. We just need to perform these systematic knockout experiments to fully demonstrate that fact. So if you have to stick to the fact that, you want to believe the genome's only 10%, 20% functional, because even evolutionists are saying in secular papers that any more than that means that we would degenerate too fast, that evolution couldn't be true. But the thing is, you still haven't given any, I've given evidence from the 3 major haplogroups, low genetic diversity, 1 Y chromosome, 1 mitochondrial DNA, the fact that genes come in 2 versions. I mean, this is all predicted by the Bible thousands of years ago. I've given you a testable, falsifiable prediction from the catastrophic plate tectonics model, and I've shown you death, degeneration, and decay of the universe and the genome based on the account of Genesis and the fall. So you haven't given us any evidence yet. So did you want to spend some time giving some evidence for universal common descent there, Taylor?
Well, you have about 75 seconds to do that. So yeah, Taylor, go ahead, Taylor.
Yeah, you take your time. Give some evidence, brother, because the debate's almost done and you haven't given any. Go ahead.
I've already done that multiple times, but I don't really care. We also have back mutation, by the way, which can flip a gene back to its wild form. But I don't care.
Well, back mutations are rare, so.
We'll just let him finish that. Yeah,
okay, go ahead.
It doesn't really matter. It's a red herring, because let's assume we started with all we're going to get, genetically speaking, and we developed from there, and we just devolved and lost information from there. That's still evolution, and you still can't provide anything that can resolve the biblical theory with what we find in the fossil record, because what we would actually find is an even distribution of all taxa, and you can't find a mammal in the lower layers. You just can't.
All right, last 15 seconds.
Okay, so I hope the audience has been able to see that no actual evidence has been provided for the evolutionary model. So by default, I win. So this has been fun. But yeah, we'll go to our closing statements then, and I'll debunk what you just said there.
All right. Well, thank you both once again for that really fascinating 20-minute of discussion. We will now head to the final part of the formal debate, which will be the closing presentations. We'll start first with Standing for Truth. Your 5 minutes begin as soon as you start.
1 second. Samuel, if you have to go, okay. I know that you have an appointment. It's totally okay. I don't want to keep you here longer than for your appointment.
All right, no worries, man. I'll finish this, and after this, I'll head over.
Thanks, buddy.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks so much. Yeah, I've given, plenty of testable, falsifiable predictions. I've given you confirmed predictions based on the catastrophic plate tectonics model. He's given no actual evidence for universal common descent. He's gone to rescue devices to explain away the accumulating damage. I've already debunked that based on the fact that the genetic noise is just too much to look to any type of rescue device. And synergistic epistasis, as he talked about in his rebuttal there, the thing is, to the extent there is substantial amount of synergistic epistasis happening, it actually makes the genetic situation worse, not better. And very, very extensive numerical simulation experiments has actually falsified the synergistic epistasis mechanism. But I have to applaud him for actually bringing up some arguments and some rescue devices for genome-wide degradation based on low impact deleterious mutations, because everyone else that I've debated, they really came unprepared, and there's no way to resolve the problem. And it's a lot of imagining and just so stories, but at least he tried, which is nice. But evolutionists, like I said, they hope, they dream, they imagine that, dogs and pine trees are related through common ancestry. But the thing is, it's just not true. It falls in the realm of pseudoscience. And even when there is very strong synergistic epistasis, it fails to curb deleterious mutation accumulation. Instead, what it does is it causes accelerated genetic degeneration and rapid extinction. But what's to be taken from this is that these primary escape mechanisms, synergistic epistasis, for example, mutation count mechanism, even the back mutations he just talked about, they're exceedingly rare. And even when they do happen, based on the amount of deleterious mutations that are flooding the genome and being transmitted from generation to generation, it's as if there's no back mutations at all. But at least he tried, unlike most of the other evolutionists, so that's nice. But these primary escape mechanisms used by evolutionists, they're artificial, contrived, and are profoundly unrealistic biologically. So the majority of beneficial mutations, they're going to escape positive selection, and the few rare beneficials will then have high impact. But these isolated high impact beneficials will only allow for adaptive episodes. And these rare anomalies happen even while the rest of the genome is undergoing systematic degeneration. So I've already presented a ton of examples for genetic entropy in real time. And I've demonstrated that natural selection is constrained hugely by selection interference, because selecting for one trait interferes with selecting for another trait. And when you have billions of traits segregating in the population, then the selection process starts to work against itself. And that means you end up with being able to only select the best and the worst mutations, as I've been talking about the entire time. I feel it's as if evolutionists just don't even listen, because anybody should be able to easily see that most mutations fall within this no selection zone, and that almost all of them are deleterious. But all evidence becomes evidence for pond scum to people evolution. But the fact is, even with strong, generous selection, if you wanted to give that to them, this entire no selection zone only undergoes complete degeneration. So it's funny, because Taylor speaks of the obvious, right? Natural selection, adaptation, few beneficial mutations, but anybody with a basic understanding of genetics understands and knows these things. So the argument of genetic entropy only begins after acknowledging these obvious things, and his rescue device mechanisms, they're not going to account for the relentless influx of deleterious mutations. And the thing is, I've given a testable model based on pre-existing functional DNA differences, and their most claimed evidence anyways, phylogenetic systematics, for example, it's mostly based on the concept of outdated junk DNA. And as we talked about in our 20-minute discussion, DNA functions are only beginning to be found during the last decade, meaning we understand less than 5%. How much longer?
40 seconds.
Meaning we understand, much less than 5% of the DNA language. It'd be like me going to Russia, reading a book, and then telling them what's a mistake and what's not. We understand so little of the DNA language. So the trajectory strongly suggests the vast majority of DNA will be functional. And this takes away from the primary assumption of evolutionary phylogenetics, which is primarily based on mutations in pseudogenes. We know pseudogenes are very important functionally as well. And if the vast majority of DNA is functional, as we're seeing, becomes a common design argument, as creationists have always predicted, the vast majority of DNA is functional. So evolution has to deal with the many problems, and then they invoke rescue device after rescue device. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for keeping to time as well. Standing for Truth. We'll now have the final 5-minute closing presentation from Snake Was Right. Taylor, time starts when you begin.
All right. So you already admit that there are processes that I'm trying to describe. You admit that there are processes that slow this process of degeneration. And these processes are numerous: synergistic epistasis, genetic purging, anti-fragility, modularity, assortative mating, balancing selection, directional selection, disruptive selection, fluctuating selection, coinophilia, mutation selection, balance, stabilizing selection, dysgenics, and I assume there are others. And so he says these are exceedingly rare, but there are, as you can see, numerous different processes going on all the time. And these are just to explain the facts that we already know, which is that their old model, the constraint model based on buildup of mutation, is not observed. We actually, I read the study earlier, it over-predicts what we actually see. So what we see is an under-dispersion of deleterious alleles and an over-dispersion of genetic variants. And that's because that's epistasis, which is, it causes different variants based on how the different mutations interact with each other. So it's not just a linear degradation where each trait just adds on top of another. And that actually increases the selection visibility. So these near neutral mutations, there are thousands, or not thousands, but many different ways that we can regulate them, because most of them are just regulatory mutations anyway. Let's see here. In Mutation Predicts 40 Million Years of Flywing Evolution, they say, here we show that the metapopulation structure, habitat loss, or fragmentation, environmental stochasticity can be expected to greatly accelerate the accumulation of mildly deleterious mutations. And he already admits that there are processes which slow the accumulation of deleterious mutations. So all we're doing is just studying how these processes work, and we're actually observing that there are cases in which we have mathematical functions, which I doubt you'll understand, but I named the studies and I'll link them to you to check out later. But we actually understand how all these work, and the way that they interact mathematically, we see that there are populations that make it through. And that's not just with the computer models, that's actually with real fly populations. We see an under-prediction or an over-prediction of deleterious alleles, which we don't actually see in reality. From that original study that I cited, the situation becomes quite different if slightly advantageous mutations occur at a constant rate. Or actually, sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing. Okay, this is also from the Flying Wing paper. In principle, the constraint hypothesis could be rescued if the vast majority of deleterious mutations... I lost it. Sorry, guys. All right. Could be rescued if the vast majority of deleterious mutations were so deleterious that they cannot contribute to evolution. But this requires the implausible assumption that deleterious mutations have the same pattern of effects as potentially advantageous ones. So all of the science disagrees explicitly with Standing for Truth's model. And
1 minute.
so I will just conclude again with the strongest evidence of the fossil record. You haven't made any. There were very weak predictions, just like predicting that the sun will come up. So, and all of your predictions based on the model of how we would see the fossils build up based on the flood doesn't comport with reality, because we see layers with progressively different populations. If the flood model was true, we would see mostly land animals dead, not 90% marine animals. And we would also find an even distribution. We would find Precambrian rabbits. We would find mammals down in the sections where we don't find any vertebrates at all. So until the creationists, the young Earth creationists, because real creationists are not other creationists believe in the evolutionist model, but until the young Earth creationists can explain why the flood layered everything in such a particular way, then I will remain unconvinced.
All right, that's it then. Thank you, Taylor, for that presentation as well, and thank you once again to Standing for Truth. Both of you have intrigued us, and hopefully the viewers watching at home as well, who will now get a chance to participate in this dialogue in the Q&A section. I hand the time over to James. James, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Samuel. We're thrilled to have you, buddy. Oh, and by the way, just wanted a quick mention. Samuel's link is now in the description. So Samuel has his own channel. It's called Explain Apologetics. Highly encourage you to check out Samuel. He's been just a huge blessing to this channel in so many ways, in helping us kind of promote this, what we're hoping is a nonpartisan channel where we can give everybody a fair shake. And so encourage you. Samuel's just a terrific guy. You're going to love him. So thanks again for coming on, Samuel.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
You bet. Take care, Samuel.
Take care.
So, I'm going to quick switch around the pictures. When we have somebody check out from Zoom, it's normal where we have the pictures scramble, and normally I panic. But it's been such a long day. I'm just too tired to. So I'm stoked to get into these questions. Thank you guys so much. This is a blast. Don't worry, I'm going to be working on the picture. If you notice, it looks a little bit funny, but don't worry, we'll get to that. And I'm going to read your questions in the meantime. We're going to have a short Q&A. Sorry, we got started a little bit late, so it's just I've got a ton of homework and kind of trying to hammer out my doctorate right now. So it's like it's really hard time-wise. That's the one thing that is really hard to manage sometimes. So Himsake, thanks so much for your super chat. We appreciate it. And Himsake said, thanks, James. Really appreciate your channel. So, well, Himsake, we really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. That means a lot to have your support. And Brian Stevens, thanks so much for your super chat. Glad to have you here, buddy. And he says, if you're wrong about non-coding DNA, is creationism wrong? So that's a question, I think, for Standing for Truth. So if you'd like, I can read that again for you.
What's the question? Sorry, James.
That's all right. He asked, if you're wrong about non-coding DNA, is creationism wrong?
Well, what's nice is a lot of times these models, for example, the LMN haplogroups, the mitochondrial DNA model that's being presented and that has made testable and falsifiable predictions, especially on the subnodes that we see on that phylogenetic tree. And then the non-coding DNA regions being functional and the preliminary data is pointing to genome-wide functionality is a testable prediction on created heterozygosity. But if that's not, if that prediction doesn't come true and that prediction is falsified, say, the model's adaptive. So at the end of the day, it wouldn't disprove creationism. It would just mean that we need to go and make more solid predictions based on our model. But so far, more and more accumulating papers are coming out suggesting important functions, pseudogene specific genetic markers are being overturned, and the junk DNA paradigm really has been overturned. So that's a prediction that I think is being confirmed and is going to be even more confirmed down the road when we understand the DNA language even more. I hope that answers this question. Thanks, James.
You bet. Thanks for that question, Brian Stevens, your super chat as well. We appreciate it. And thanks for your answers, Standing for Truth. And Justin R., thanks so much for your super chat, bud. And he says, thanks, James, for setting up the channel. Keep it up. Thanks so much. I appreciate that, Justin. We're really encouraged that you are enjoying it. So we're thrilled to have you here, too, and that we all get to enjoy this together. So it means a lot. And always hold us accountable, whether it be, I don't know if I mentioned, Samuel will be actually he'll be sometimes taking the lead on moderating where I won't even be here. Especially on theology. He loves theology. I do too, but not as much as Samuel. So we are going to have Samuel sometimes, or it'll just be Samuel, and I will be probably like trying to do homework or whatever. So it's almost always I'm going to be doing homework. But next one, thanks so much for your guys' super chats. Crag Nightwolf emailed, and he said, if your model of, and this is kind of the setup for the question, if your model of genetic entropy truly has predictive powers like evolution, then that can be relied upon, please make a prediction on which specific organisms we should be seeing going extinct, and specifically how far in the near future due to your supposed knowledge of genetic entropy.
So for sure, we should see higher mammals going extinct based on mutation accumulation more quickly. Something like a bacteria, I mean, it goes through more rounds of selection, has more generation times, and should degenerate slower. But the thing is, reductive evolution is also common in bacteria as well. And Lenski himself is demonstrating reductive evolution adaptation via genetic degeneration, loss of genes. So even bacteria, we can now predict are not going forward evolutionary speaking. So we would certainly predict, though, that mammals, humans are going to degenerate faster, and we've already got plenty of examples of entropic degeneration on all levels. So we know how many mutations are accumulated and passed on from generation to generation, and genomes are devolving, and the genome's rusting out like a car. So that would be the prediction that we actually viruses we predict would degenerate very fast as well. And that's why there's been important work done on the human version of the flu, H1N1, and it's gone from a red hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event. I think it's 90 years. So you can look up the paper on that. I think it's peer reviewed and published in the NIH journal. So plenty of predictions and already some confirmations as well. So thanks for the question. I appreciate it.
Well, can I add something on to that a little bit?
You bet.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't understand under your model why there's different things going extinct at different rates, because, and also the H1N1 went extinct in humans because they're not a human virus. So I don't understand how the Neanderthals, why did they branch off from humans and go extinct before the rest of us?
Well, the thing is, the Neanderthals were a subpopulation of humans that branched off and isolated themselves after the Tower of Babel and probably during the Ice Age. So a lot of it was due to inbreeding, because inbreeding exposes the genetic mistakes within the genome. But the thing is, like I've said before, inbreeding, it's like a sneak preview of where we are going genetically as a species. So if you want to know where we're going based on these accumulation of mutations, you can look at examples like mammoth populations, Neanderthal populations. That's all I got to say.
Doesn't that explain that there's something going on that's slowing down the mutation of others in comparison?
What's that? You kind of cut out there.
Doesn't that demonstrate that there's something between those who are going extinct quickly and those who aren't, that there's some kind of something slowing down the accumulation of mutation?
Well, natural selection based on larger populations could probably slow down the degeneration process. But the thing is, it's not going to be able to stop the degeneration process. And viruses and bacteria, as I said, those microbes would be expected to degenerate slowly because mutation rate per genome is low and selection is intense and continuous, as I've said. But like I said, even the RNA virus has been shown to be subject to genetic entropy. And you can read that paper as well. I think found in the NIH journal.
We've done the math, and there are things we can do to overcome the accumulation. So I don't understand where you get the basis that you can.
No, because there's extensive numerical simulations. For example, synergistic epistasis has been sufficiently falsified. So I can send you that paper as well. But Dr. John Sanford has studied this more than any other population geneticist. I mean, Kimura, his model was oversimplified. The no selection zone, beneficial mutations, natural selection. I mean, it can't be stopped. It can be slowed down. Yeah, I agree with that. But at the end of the day, it can't be stopped, and there's no evidence that it can be stopped or will be stopped. So there's examples in inbred populations like Homo neanderthal and the hobbits and the mammoths, all high genetic load, and you can see the various pathologies that occur because of it. But at the end of the day, it's just the inbreeding's a sneak preview as to where we're going as a species. So yeah, I know you guys have artificially contrived mechanisms, and most of the time they're not even biologically real. But those that want to hold on to that type of evolution, well, obviously they're going to have to come up with something. But I'm sitting back, relaxing, and just taking in the evidence for what it is.
Well, if you want to go there, I mean, Sanford is a creationist, a young Earth creationist, and he has produced bad models, so I don't understand how he's an authority on that.
Well, it's a trade secret among population geneticists that man is presently degenerating and that they panic about the near neutral mutation problem. But Dr. John Sanford
came up with that for evolution.
It is, but we can agree to disagree and go on to another question.
All right.
All right. So Sorry, I got distracted. Trying to keep up with the questions as they've come in, and thanks for your patience. We've only got a few minutes left of Q&A. I'm sorry to do that, but we got to do it. It's just to respect everybody's time. The second thing is reports of like people calling people names like retard in the audience. Please don't do that. We usually only
Nice, yeah.
we only usually like go after hate speech, but like we actually would prefer, it's okay to criticize ideas, go for it, nobody cares. But if you want to try to refrain from criticizing people, and especially like name calling, like using the R word like that. So, and I don't mean to imply that basically it's just I don't think people should use the R word in that way as an insult. So, John, let's see. I'm going to catch up with you for the alleged profanity. If you guys can do me a favor, we can like let profanity fly in the chat, but we'd ask you not to, just to try to keep it so that it's not too distracting from the ideas and arguments and stuff. And so that's both sides. Both sides are guilty of that. So I'm not trying to point anybody out or put them on the spot. Next up, thanks for your patience. Saint Dragon asks, standing for truth, what is your degree?
Oh, that same type of question was asked, I think, 2 debates ago. I don't really think it's even relevant to this. Is that Saint Dragon? Yeah, maybe we can set up a debate with him and I, and we'll see how well he fares in the lion's den with standing for truth. But yeah, that's all I got to say to that. I don't. My predictions that I provided. Tell me.
You don't have any.
Yeah, you didn't produce a single prediction. Just making your little fairy tale try to fit with reality is not a prediction.
Processes that would explain the fossil record, and we actually have the testable and falsifiable predictions. For one, polystrate fossils that extend through many layers of rock completely destroy all their assumptions of the geological column, uniformitarian processes, macroevolution. Now, at the end of the day, when we look at the continents today, they're moving very little. But when we look to Noah's flood, we aren't looking at continental drift anymore. We're actually looking at continental sprint, meters per second movement of the plates, of the continents. This model, CPT, it predicts that the pre-flood ocean crust would be dragged down into the mantle in a process that we actually call subduction process. Now, because that happened recently, only a few thousand years ago, according to our model, the cold ocean crust should still be cold, even though it has descended into the deep, hot mantle. We've made the predictions. I want to hear what predictions they've made and confirm predictions, because modern seismologists have actually discovered that there are indeed huge cold slabs of rock down near the core itself in areas that should actually have warmed. A prediction by creationists, geologists. Another amazing prediction too. Let's go on to more and more. That's what this is all about. They're ignoring loads and loads of evidence. Another amazing prediction that has actually been confirmed again in this model of say, catastrophic plate tectonics is rapid magnetic reversals. The Earth's magnetic field draws our compass needle towards the north, but sometimes in Earth's history, it draws it towards the south. Old age geologists believe that this has been happening for hundreds of millions of years and would have taken thousands of years to occur. It was old Earth geologists that found confirming evidence of rapid magnetic reversals, and these are actually required for Noah's flood, of course. They were taking a look at lava flows that would only take a couple of weeks in order to form. They took measurements of the skin of the lava is what they did to see the magnetic orientation. Now, they were expecting to see almost no change as they went deeper into the hot lava, where the interior should shift only slightly. Instead, what they actually found was the outside skin pointed north and the inside pointed south. So we have confirmation evidence from lava flows that the switch of magnetic field has to happen rapidly, which is exactly what flood geologists expected. Prediction after prediction. My predictions that I provided. Tell me.
You don't have any.
Yeah, you didn't produce a single prediction. Just making your little fairy tale try to fit with reality is not a prediction.
you give me a specific example of a fossil that was found in the right place that is considered a transition between different kinds of animals? What's been found?
Archaeopteryx was the first.
And are you aware of the controversy over Archaeopteryx? Was it just a bird?
It has both bird and dinosauric features.
Decided by who? Who decided it has these different features?
It has the same basic bone structure as a bird wing, except unfused finger bones. And it has feathers. And it looks like a bird.
And is there a possibility it was a bird? It had wings, it had feathers, it had hollow bones. Could it have been an unusual bird with teeth? There's a Panamanian hummingbird that has teeth in its mouth. Could it be it's just a bird with teeth and that's now gone extinct? How would you know Archaeopteryx was able to produce anything other than a baby Archaeopteryx?
Because it's more similar to dinosaurs in its skull structure and its overall body plan.
Well, the fact that it has dinosaur-like structures, that's like saying my car has motorcycle-like structures. It has a brake system, just like my motorcycle. Oh, therefore they're related. No, that's a good design feature. You want something to stop the vehicle. Brakes on a motorcycle, brakes on a bicycle, brakes on a car, on a train, on a jet. So the fact that it has similar features, you are interpreting to be evidence of relationship. I would interpret it to be evidence of a common designer for a common need. They both needed these creatures to live their life. We have two eyes, so we get binocular vision. So
that's an argument. That's an argument from personal incredulity because because it's just a guess and saying, well, it seems more likely to me. But we've actually tested our model. We found Archaeopteryx because we assumed that it would be a transition. It was found because of the model, meaning the model is accurate.
Well, I think you need to study some more on the actual Archaeopteryx and find out about them. I think many people have come to say that's nothing but just a bird with unusual features. There's also some evidence of some forgery with some of the fossils with Archaeopteryx, gluing the tail on, etc., with the different matrix behind it, the limestone matrix it was glued in being different. There's also evidence of a phenomena called where when you pack something between two layers of rock, as it decays, it'll be a capillary action, pulling little filaments out that look like hairs or feathers, when it's actually just capillary action common between two tightly pressed layers of anything. You can put a drop of water on a piece of paper, put another piece of paper on top real tight, and there'll be capillary action, draw it out into little lines around it. So there are those who take that position, that the feathers, that they say they're feathers on dinosaurs, are actually just simple capillary action as the fossil forms, or as the fossil decays, as the creature decays. But again, you're putting an awful lot of weight on fossils that are dead, that you can't prove had any children. You're claiming evolution happened in the past. Where is it happening today? What animal today is changing into something else? Or is it just coincidence that we've arrived?
Everyone agrees the Archaeopteryx has feathers. And this here.
Yes. Archaeopteryx. Absolutely. Oh, I love Archaeopteryx.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so old. I knew about Archaeopteryx before you were born.
Predicted by the evolutionary model.
You know what Fiducia calls it, right? I even have slides on it. He calls it a bird, a true bird, a strong flyer. He calls it paleobabble to think it came from a reptile. Are you familiar with the paleobabble quote?
No. So
okay.
That's great. The main point is if you think that that's a bird, then you already understand how a dinosaur becomes a bird, because that is a dinosaur with feathers. That's not a bird.
Okay. Well, I've got slides and quotes of evolutionists who would disagree with you. And
yeah, but you know, right? that that's not the evolutionary position, which is why you're debating it right now.
Well, doesn't Fiducia have any point?
I don't really care.
Okay, well, I think you're exposed
because we all know that evolution says that these are related.
Evolution says that means every single evolutionist. Come on, you know
that's that's what evolution is.
Okay, well, Ellen Fiducia, North Carolina State disagrees with you.
I don't think so. There's some debate. There's some debate about exactly what lineage Archaeopteryx is a part of, but there's no debate in evolution whether they're related or not.
Okay, there's my Archaeopteryx. I don't know if that's up there, is it?
Yep, I see it.
Okay, they had very strange traits that birds have today. Stars Olsen, you've heard of him, right? one of the grander hoaxes of it. Are you familiar with Stars Olson?
No.
Please write it down. He was the Birdman in the United States. STORRS Olson. He called it a hoax, the equivalent of cold fusion. Ellen Fiducia, world expert on birds. They tried to turn Archaeopteryx into a earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a bird, a perching bird. And here's that paleobabble quote. And again, please look it up. No amount of paleobabble is going to change that. And there's many more evolutionists who do not embrace Archaeopteryx as an ancestor to a bird. Okay.
All of them crammed into this one tiny boat. And those 16,000 somehow evolved into the 10 billion species that we see today in just 4,000 years.
Now, created heterozygosity hypothesis, if we actually have these heterozygous ancestors, right, as you know, as I've explained before, if God created the original created kinds, Adam and Eve, with pre-existing functional DNA differences and almost limitless variety of combinations of chromosomes, genes, and traits are possible. We've made predictions, okay? These predictions are coming true. The vast majority of our genome is functional. We don't need mutations to actually explain the changes, the micro changes as you talk about.
Yet they do.
It's a recombination and gene conversion. And that's going to provide many new varieties of combination of traits quickly, since, as I've said, the differences are already built in.
All the time.
Well, what do you have against that model? Because that's what we see. We see a pre-existing functional DNA differences. You guys look to...
Really, except that it's not observed. And even assuming that model, the fossil transitions that we see in the fossil record are...
Adam and Eve were created with pre-existing functional DNA differences. We can see this because the majority of our genome is functional, okay? So with amazing design and functional heterozygosity, even at a tiny fraction of their nucleotide snake, through the processes of gene conversion and recombination, an essentially unlimited range of useful diversity would be produced. What is your objection to that?
I've already stated that I don't really have an objection to that.
I don't really have an objection to that.
Acknowledge you failed on the catastrophic plate tectonics. Now you failed to give an objection to created heterozygosity hypothesis. Now you want to go to transitional forms. You want to be 0 for 3 or you want to be 1 for 2?